Hello everyone. I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. In the hum. Phase 1, the unsettling mundane. My world is built of sound. Not music, not conversation, but the textured silence in between. I am a sound designer, which is a polite way of saying I spend my days in a darkened room in my Kichijoji apartment, surgically removing the unwanted noises of reality from film scenes. The accidental cough of a background extra, the whisper of a polyester jacket, the groan of a floorboard that wasn't in the script. I am a cleaner of audio, a polisher of silence. My ears are my most valuable, most finely tuned instruments. My life, like my work, is meticulously curated for minimal interference. I live alone. My cat, Tora, a stripe of orange smoke with an opinion on everything, is my only roommate. My apartment is on the third floor of a respectable concrete building that smells of old tatami and the faint, sweet scent of Mrs. Sato's dashi broth from the apartment below. The neighborhood is a placid corner of Tokyo, a 15-minute walk from the trendy chaos surrounding the station and the swan boats of Inokashira Park. Here, the loudest sounds are the evening chime from the local school, the chirping of cicadas in summer, and the polite clatter of garbage bins on collection day. It is a controlled, predictable soundscape. My soundscape. Until the hum began. It arrived without fanfare, a low-frequency intruder in the dead of night. At first, I mistook it for tinnitus, a phantom born of stress and too many hours wearing headphones. It was a bass note with no discernible source, a pressure in my ears more than a sound, like a colossal engine idling miles away. I'd take my headphones off, and it would still be there, a vibration in my jawbone. I'd get up, press my ear to the window, feeling the cool glass against my skin. Nothing but the distant sigh of the city. My professional curiosity was piqued before any real anxiety set in. I unpacked my field recording kit, a sound devices Mixpre 6.2, a pair of Sennheisers. Highly sensitive, unforgivingly accurate equipment. I placed mics around the room, ran the cables to the recorder, and slipped on my monitoring headphones. I could hear the tiny electronic wheeze of my Wi-Fi router, the glacial tick of the refrigerator's defrost cycle, the sound of my own blood pulsing in my ears. But of the hum, there was nothing. Not a flicker on the digital display. Not a whisper in the recording. I tried again the next night, and the next. The hum remained, a ghost in my perception, stubbornly refusing to exist on any physical medium. It was a contradiction that scratched at the edge of my professional pride. If a sound cannot be recorded, is it truly a sound? Or is the recording device, in this case, my own brain, simply malfunctioning? I chose to believe the latter. I was overworked. I needed more sleep. I cut back on caffeine. But the hum persisted, a deep, resonant foundation upon which the day's other sounds were now layered. The first hint that it wasn't just me came from Mrs. Sato. I met her in the hallway as I was leaving for a rare grocery run. She was a tiny woman, perpetually stooped, with kind, watery eyes. Today, those eyes were narrowed with irritation. "Kawahara-san," she said, her voice tighter than usual. "You're walking. It's very heavy these days." I blinked. I was known for my light tread. In my profession, you learn to move silently. My apologies, Sato-san. I will be more careful. It's not the noise, she clarified, tapping a wrinkled finger against her temple. It's the vibration. It flows wrongly. It disturbs the quiet. She shuffled away, leaving me standing in the sterile hallway. Flows wrongly. It was a bizarre choice of words. I hadn't been home for most of the morning. I had been sitting perfectly still at my desk. A few days later, Tora started acting strangely. He had always loved the refrigerator, sleeping on its warm top, lulled by its gentle drone. Now, he wouldn't go near it. He would sit at the kitchen doorway, fur bristling, and emit a low, guttural hiss, not at anything visible, but at the appliance itself. Then he abandoned the top of my amplifier, another favorite spot. Soon, he was hissing at the television, the router, my laptop charger. It was as if every electronic device in the apartment had personally offended him. He took to sleeping in the gen can, by the front door, the most electronically sterile part of the house. The unease was a seed, planted in the fertile ground of my isolation. I started noticing things. Mr. Tanaka, who lived in the house across the narrow street, had always been a proud gardener, a master of bonsai. I now saw him tending his miniature pines wearing a pair of enormous, bright yellow industrial ear defenders, the kind used by airport ground crew. He moved with a new, jerky slowness, his head cocked as if listening for something even through the thick padding. The oddities were piling up, small and easily dismissible on their own. Together, they felt like a language I didn't understand. I tried to mention it to Kenji during our weekly video call. Kenji was my producer, my main tether to the film world, a man whose cheerful pragmatism usually grounded me. "Things are a bit strange here," I said, trying to sound casual. "Strange how?" "Did you finally leave your apartment and discover the outside world?" he joked. "No, just, the neighbors. Everyone seems on edge. Sensitive to noise." "It's Tokyo, Naomi-san," he said, his smile unwavering. "We live in glorified shoeboxes stacked on top of each other. Everyone is sensitive to noise." He was right, of course. It was the most logical explanation. And yet, it felt profoundly wrong. This wasn't about noise. This was about something else. Mrs. Sato's words came back to me. "It disturbs the quiet." The breaking point, the moment my carefully constructed wall of rationalization crumbled, came a week later. I was working on a scene set in a quiet library, meticulously filtering out the faint air conditioning drone. The hum in my apartment was particularly insistent that night, a palpable thrum that made my teeth ache. Frustrated, I took a break and went to the kitchen for some tea. My window looks out over the small, shared courtyard and the apartment building opposite. As I waited for the water to boil, I saw a light on in the apartment directly across from mine. A young couple I didn't know well lived there. Through their window, I could see the man standing in the middle of his living room. He was holding a chair. He placed it down, took a step back, tilted his head, and listened. Then he picked it up, moved it 6 inches to the left, and listened again. His partner watched, nodding slowly. They repeated this ritual with their sofa, their television stand, their coffee table. It wasn't redecorating. It was a precise, solemn ceremony. They were like priests arranging an altar, each movement deliberate, each placement critical. They were tuning their room. And as I watched, transfixed, the man looked up, his eyes meeting mine across the courtyard. There was no recognition in his gaze, no embarrassment at being caught in a private, bizarre act. There was only a calm, placid focus. He tilted his head one more time, a subtle, bird-like motion, and then his wife drew the curtains. I stood in my dark kitchen, the kettle's shriek making me jump. The sound felt alien, a violation. My heart was pounding, a frantic, messy rhythm against the steady, deep, and patient hum of the world outside. It wasn't me. It wasn't my ears. Something was happening. And for the first time, I was truly afraid. Tora, from his post by the door, let out a soft, mournful meow. He had been afraid for weeks. I was only just catching up. Phase 2, growing awareness and isolation. The world did not fall apart overnight. It simply, retuned. The change was insidious, a creeping alteration of the mundane that made me question my own senses at every turn. The hum was no longer just a nighttime phenomenon, it was a constant companion, a low-level vibration that seemed to emanate from the very bones of the city. I began to see its effects everywhere. At the local konbini. The clerk, a young man who usually had earbuds in, blasting some pop group, now wore a single, flesh-colored foam earplug. When I spoke, he'd turn his unprotected ear towards me, his expression one of intense, strained concentration, as if my simple request for a bottle of green tea was a complex audio signal he needed to parse. On the train, more people than usual wore noise-canceling headphones, not with the glazed-over look of commuters lost in music, but with a tense alertness, their eyes scanning the carriage. The neighborhood continued its silent, strange transformation. Mrs. Sato stopped complaining about my footsteps. Instead, I'd hear a soft, rhythmic thump-thump-thump from her apartment at odd hours. Peeking through my peephole one afternoon, I saw her in the hallway, gently knocking on the wall with the heel of her hand, her head tilted, a faint, serene smile on her face. She was listening to the building's resonance. My isolation deepened. My work, once a refuge, now felt like a prison. The silence I crafted for the films was a lie. It was a hollow, artificial quiet, completely unlike the new, heavy, meaningful quiet that was settling over Kichijoji. The real world was pregnant with a sound I couldn't define, and the more I noticed it, the more I felt like a discordant note in a symphony everyone else was slowly learning to play. Desperate for a distraction, for a piece of the old, normal world, I took a walk to the warren of second-hand stores south of the station. I've always loved the scent of them, a mix of old paper, dust, and forgotten lives. I was drifting through a shop that specialized in defunct media, running my fingers over dusty laserdiscs and stacks of video games for consoles that were now museum pieces, when I saw it. It was in a cardboard box overflowing with cassette tapes. Most were official albums or cheap mixtapes with song titles scrawled in teenage handwriting. But one stood out. A TDK D90, its cream-colored label meticulously lettered in neat, black ink. It didn't have a band or a track list. It just had a single, cryptic phrase. Tadashii Shuhasada Kaik. Listen at the right frequency. I don't know why I picked it up. It felt less like a choice and more like a compulsion. The tape felt heavy in my hand, dense with unspoken importance. In a world that was ceasing to make sense, this felt like a clue. A piece of a puzzle I hadn't even known I was trying to solve. I paid the shopkeeper a handful of yen and slipped it into my pocket, the sharp plastic corners a grounding presence against my leg. Back in my apartment, I stared at the tape. I hadn't owned a cassette player in 15 years. The subplot of my life now required a prop from a bygone era. My attempts to find an ally were a failure. I called Kenji again, my voice tight with a poorly concealed panic. Kenji-san, I have to talk to you. The thing I mentioned before, the noise, it's getting worse. People are acting so strangely. They're all listening to something. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Naomi-san, he said, his voice laced with a careful, measured concern that was far more alarming than his earlier dismissal. You've been working too hard. That project has you cooped up. Why don't you take a week off? Go to Hakone, see the mountains. Get away from the city noise. It's not the noise, it's the lack of it. I nearly shouted. It's what's underneath. Kenji, please, just listen for it. I'm listening to you, Naomi, he said softly. And you sound like you need a break. We can push the deadline. Just take care of yourself. He hung up. He thought I was losing my mind. The conversation left me feeling utterly, terrifyingly alone, adrift in a sea of placid insanity. Maybe he was right. Maybe the hum was a tumor in my auditory cortex, and the strange behaviors were just me, projecting my own decay onto the world. And then the email arrived. It was from Kenji. The subject line was, "Weird audio file, can you check?" My heart seized. The body of the email was brief. Naomi-san. Sorry if I was dismissive earlier. A strange thing just happened. My sister sent me this. My nephew recorded it on his phone. Says it's the sound he hears in his head sometimes. It's probably just phone interference, but she's worried. You're the expert. Can you clean it up, see if it's anything? Kenji. Attached was a single file, resonance.wave. My hands trembled as I downloaded it. This was it. This was proof. A recording. Something tangible. I felt a surge of vindication so powerful it almost made me dizzy. I wasn't crazy. I opened the file in my editing software, Pro Tools. The waveform was a dense, jagged mess. It looked like pure digital noise, a solid block of corrupted data. But as I zoomed in, I saw a faint, repeating pattern buried deep within the chaos, a rhythmic pulse. I put on my Bayer Dynamic DT 770s, headphones that could reveal the subtlest of flaws. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the frantic hammering in my chest, and I pressed the spacebar. The sound that erupted in my ears was not the low hum I expected. It was a high-frequency, metallic screech, a grinding, serrated noise like a server farm being torn apart. It was physically painful, but underneath the shriek, for a fraction of a second, I heard it. The hum. Pure, distilled, and impossibly loud. My vision went white. The world collapsed into a single point of light, and a feeling of immense, terrifying vertigo washed over me, as if I were falling from a great height. I didn't pass out, not completely. It was a momentary cognitive death. A blue screen of the soul. When my senses rebooted a second later, the screech was gone. My screen was flickering, lines of green code glitching across my audio software. The hum in my apartment had changed. It was no longer a vague pressure. It was now a distinct, defined frequency, a clear G-sharp that vibrated behind my eyes. I knew its pitch. I could name it. The file had tuned me. From under the sofa, Tora let out a strangled, terrified yowl. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp certainty. This was not mass hysteria. This was not a psychological break. This was an event. An active, spreading phenomenon. And I had just willingly exposed myself to its purest form. My research became frantic. I dove into the darkest corners of the internet, searching for forums and message boards, using keywords from my new, terrifying vocabulary, auditory resonance, cognitive retuning, the G-sharp hum, infrastructural sound. I found fragments, whispers. Paranoid posts on fringe science websites, quickly deleted or buried under mocking comments. A Reddit thread titled, "Can anyone else hear the tone?" that had been nuked by the moderators. A single, cryptic blog post from 3 years ago, titled, "The Static is Listening," describing a phenomenon in a small town in rural Finland, where people started arranging stones in spiral patterns and refusing to speak. The post ended abruptly. The blog was never updated again. It was a trail of digital breadcrumbs leading nowhere, evidence of others who had noticed, who had tried to speak out, only to be silenced or to simply vanish. Finally, late one night, with the G-sharp hum pressing in on me, I remembered the cassette tape. I had to find a player. A frantic search of my own apartment yielded nothing. The next day, I ventured back out into the world, the hum a constant presence at the base of my skull. Every person I passed was a potential carrier, a vessel for the resonance. I felt exposed, my senses raw. I found what I needed in another second-hand shop, a slightly battered Sony Walkman, its silver paint worn down to the black plastic underneath. It felt like a relic from an ancient civilization. Back in the suffocating quiet of my room, I slid the cassette into the player. The mechanical clunk of the door closing was a sound from my childhood, a deeply nostalgic noise that felt worlds away from my current reality. I put on the headphones, the cheap foam pads a poor substitute for my studio monitors, and pressed play. The tape hissed to life. It was a low-quality recording, thick with analog static. For a full minute, that was all there was. Then, a voice emerged from the magnetic fog. It was a man's voice, calm and detached, distorted by the poor recording. "Must understand," the voice said. The words swimming in and out of the static. "It is not an attack. It is a an adjustment. The space has to be tuned. A burst of noise, then silence. I fast-forwarded. The wrong resonance, the voice continued, clearer now. We were built on the wrong resonance. A fundamental error. It makes noise. Conflict. The adjustment silences the error. I rewound, listening again and again. The speaker wasn't panicked. He wasn't warning anyone. He sounded like a lecturer, a guide. Don't fight it. You'll only hurt yourself. The key is alignment. Listen at the right frequency. Let it in. You have to close the door to the old sound. The tape clicked off. The end. I sat in the dark, the headphones still on, listening to the empty hiss. Close the door to the old sound. The phrase echoed in my mind. The cassette wasn't a warning. It wasn't a cry for help from a fellow victim. It was an instruction manual. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. The pieces clicked into place with the chilling finality of a closing coffin lid. The hum, the resonance file from Kenji's nephew, the cassette tape, they were all part of the same thing. The hum was the ambient broadcast. The file was a concentrated, weaponized dose designed to accelerate the tuning process. And the tape was the user's guide for surrender, written by an early adopter. My mind, accustomed to isolating and analyzing signals, began to form a terrifying hypothesis. This wasn't a sound in the auditory sense. It was a resonance wave, a frequency that didn't just interact with the eardrum, but with the very structure of matter and consciousness. It was rewriting reality, starting with our perception of it. People weren't going mad, their neurology was being rewired, upgraded to a new operating system. The furniture rearranging, the earplugs, the wall tapping, these weren't symptoms of a sickness. They were the actions of people trying to get better reception. They were optimizing their environment for the new signal. I was the one with the outdated hardware, running on a legacy system, experiencing the new world as a bug, a terrifying system error. The world outside my window began to prove my theory. The subtle environmental warping was becoming more pronounced, more confident. The streetlights on my block no longer just flickered. They pulsed in unison, a slow, rhythmic dimming and brightening that perfectly matched the G-sharp thrumming in my skull. It was a communication, a citywide status indicator. All systems nominal. One afternoon, I walked to an Okashira park, needing to see a space that wasn't defined by concrete and right angles. I stood by the edge of the pond, watching the swan boats glide across the murky water. For a brief, stomach-lurching moment, the reflection of a willow tree on the far bank shivered violently, its mirrored leaves dissolving into pixels and reforming, even as the real tree stood perfectly still in the windless air. I squeezed my eyes shut, and when I opened them, the reflection was normal again. Had I imagined it? Or had I caught the rendering engine lagging for a split second? The isolation was becoming absolute. I was an atheist at a fundamentalist revival, the only one not speaking in tongues. The quiet, unsettling behaviors were becoming organized. One evening, drawn by a sudden, profound silence, the hum dropping away for a moment to an almost inaudible level, I looked out my window. On the street below, dozens of my neighbors were standing outside their homes. They had emerged silently, a congregation summoned by an inaudible bell. Mrs. Sato, Mr. Tanaka without his ear defenders, the young couple from across the way. They stood in loose, geometric formations, all facing east, towards the distant glow of Shinjuku. Their heads were tilted at that same, subtly unnatural angle. They weren't speaking. They weren't moving. They were simply, listening. Receiving an update. After 5 minutes, the hum swelled back to its usual intensity, and as if a switch had been flipped, they all turned and walked calmly back into their homes. The street was empty again. The event had been silent, peaceful, and more terrifying than any riot. Just as I felt the last vestiges of my hope begin to fray, my phone rang. The screen displayed Kenji's name. I almost didn't answer, my hand hovering over the reject button. What could I say to him? But a desperate, foolish part of me still craved a connection. I answered. Naomi-san. His voice was different. The forced cheerfulness was gone, replaced by a quiet, somber tone. Kenji-san. You were right, he said, and my heart leapt. I'm sorry I didn't listen to you. About the hum. I hear it now. All the time. Tears of relief pricked my eyes. You do. You really hear it? Yes, he said. Since a few days ago. It's everywhere. It's changing things. I don't understand it. I'm scared, Naomi. You were the first one to notice. Maybe you know what's happening. Can we meet? Please. We can figure this out together. An ally. Finally. The relief was so overwhelming it felt like a physical wave, washing away weeks of accumulated fear. Yes, I said, my voice thick. Of course. Where? We agreed to meet at a small, quiet coffee shop near the park, a neutral space. I spent the next hour preparing, scribbling notes, my mind racing. I would tell him about the resonance file, the tape, my theory about the frequency rewriting perception. We could find a way to fight it, to create a counter-frequency, to shield ourselves. We could find others. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I wasn't alone. I saw him through the window of the cafe before I went in. He was sitting at a small table, staring into a cup of coffee. He looked calm. Too calm. A warning bell, a discordant note, sounded in my head. I pushed it down. He was just scared, putting on a brave face. I slid into the seat opposite him. Kenji-san. He looked up, and the hope in my chest turned to ice. His eyes. They were the same eyes as the man across the courtyard. Placid, serene, untroubled. The frantic energy of his phone call was completely gone. Naomi-san, he said, his voice a gentle murmur, perfectly in tune with the hum that vibrated through the floor. Thank you for coming. I was worried you wouldn't. Kenji, you said you were scared, I stammered, my carefully prepared notes suddenly feeling ridiculous in my hand. I was, he said, nodding slowly. Before I understood. Before I stopped fighting it. That's the mistake we all make at first. The fear is just, static. A side effect of resistance. My blood ran cold. This wasn't a rescue mission. It was an intervention. He hadn't called me to ask for help. He was here to convert me. The file I sent you, he continued, his tone that of a patient teacher. My nephew wasn't scared. He was trying to share it. A gift. It's a shortcut, you see. It helps you synchronize more quickly. It's so much clearer now, Naomi-san. The noise of the world, the pointless chatter, the anxiety, it's all gone. There is only the signal. It's so peaceful. He reached for his phone, which was lying on the table. You are so sensitive, so attuned to sound. You would appreciate the purity of it more than anyone. Let me play you a better version. A clearer one. His thumb moved towards the screen. I saw a waveform loaded, ready to play. It was the same jagged, weaponized shape as the resonance.wave file. Panic, primal and absolute, cut through my paralysis. I scrambled backward, my chair screeching against the floor, a horrible, discordant sound. Kenji flinched, his serene expression momentarily broken by a flash of pain, as if my panic was an audio spike that hurt his newly sensitive ears. Don't! I yelled, a word that felt clumsy and brutal in the quiet cafe. I didn't wait for his response. I turned and fled, bursting out of the door and into the street, leaving him sitting there in the cafe's warm light. I ran without thinking, my only instinct to get back to my sanctuary, my apartment. But as I sprinted through the quiet residential streets, a horrifying realization dawned. My apartment wasn't a sanctuary. It was just a box. And the signal was everywhere. Phase 4, Confrontation/Revelation and Aftermath. I slammed my apartment door shut, ramming the deadbolt home with a satisfyingly violent thunk. My sanctuary. My fortress of solitude. The words echoed in my head, hollow and absurd. I was panting, leaning against the door, my heart a wild, arrhythmic drum solo. The confrontation with Kenji had stripped away my last illusion. There was no we to figure this out. There was only me and them. The G-sharp hum in the room was louder than ever, a physical presence that seemed to make the air thick and heavy. It wasn't just in my head anymore, I could feel it vibrating up from the floor, through the walls, down from the ceiling. The building was a giant tuning fork, and I was trapped inside. Tora was no longer hiding. He was sitting in the exact center of the living room, perfectly still, his orange tail wrapped neatly around his paws. He looked at me as I stumbled in, his gaze as placid and untroubled as Kenji's. He let out a soft purr, a low rumble that was, I realized with a fresh wave of horror, in perfect harmony with the hum. He had synchronized. My gaze fell on the old Sony Walkman sitting on my desk. Listen at the right frequency. The words from the tape, the phrase on the label. My desperate hope had been that it was a clue to a defense, a way to fight back. Kenji's placid evangelism had poisoned that idea, but the engineer in me, the problem solver, refused to let it go. It's not about volume, I thought, my mind racing. It's about frequency. I grabbed the cassette tape. I wasn't going to listen to it. I was going to dissect it. I hooked the Walkman's headphone output to my audio interface, feeding the signal directly into my computer. I recorded the entire tape, the distorted voice, the hiss, the static. Then I opened the recording in a spectral analysis program, a tool that visualizes sound, turning it into a landscape of frequencies and amplitudes. The static was a noisy, chaotic mess across the spectrum. But the man's voice, when he spoke, occupied a very specific, narrow frequency band. It was unnatural for a human voice, too focused. I isolated it, filtering out everything else. And I saw it. The core frequency of his voice, the fundamental tone around which his words were formed, was 15.625 kHz. A strange number. A high-pitched whine, barely audible to most adults. Then I remembered, it was the line frequency of old PAL television broadcasts. A carrier wave. A signal. A terrible, new hypothesis bloomed in my mind. What if this wasn't the frequency of the cure, but the frequency of the control? A way to broadcast a countersignal? A way to create a bubble of the old reality? With a surge of manic energy, I went to work. I still had my studio monitors, my powerful amplifier. I opened a signal generator program, typed in 15.625 kHz, and turned the volume up. A piercing, needle-thin whine filled the room, a sound at the very edge of my hearing. Tora flattened his ears, his serenity broken. He hissed, a sound of pure annoyance, and fled to the gen can. It was working. The G-sharp hum in my head receded, pushed back by the intrusive, insistent whine. The pressure in my skull lessened. For the first time in weeks, I felt a semblance of my old self, a sense of clarity. I had built a sonic wall, an acoustic Faraday cage. I stood in the middle of my living room, bathed in the high-frequency shriek, feeling a triumphant, giddy relief. I had done it. I had found a way to resist. But my triumph was short-lived. I walked to the window, peering out into the night. My sonic wall was only apartment-sized. The world outside was still fully under the sway of the hum. The streetlights pulsed their slow, steady rhythm. The city glowed, a vast, synchronized circuit board. And as I watched, the lights of the towering skyscrapers in Shinjuku, miles away on the horizon, flickered. Then, in perfect, terrifying unison, they began to pulse with the same rhythm as the streetlight outside my window. It wasn't local. It wasn't Kichijoji. It was Tokyo. It was probably the whole world. My sonic bubble wasn't a fortress. It was a prison cell. I could stay here. In this room, bathing in an agonizing shriek until my equipment failed or the power went out. And then what? The final, devastating revelation came as I stared at the pulsing skyline. I thought back to the voice on the tape. Close the door to the old sound. My high-frequency whine, that was the old sound. The static of resistance, as Kenji had called it. The tape wasn't a guide to building a shield. It was a guide to dismantling one. The man on the tape wasn't a resistor. He was one of the first converts, leaving instructions for those who would follow, explaining how to let go of the painful, noisy frequencies of the old world. The right frequency wasn't the one to broadcast, it was the one you had to align yourself with. The hum itself. The tape was a key, but I had been trying to use it to lock the door from the inside, when it was designed to open it wide. I looked around my room. My equipment, my tools, my life's work. All of it was designed to control sound, to filter, to isolate, to create an artificial reality. I was the ultimate resistor, a professional denier of the world's true soundscape. Slowly, deliberately, I walked back to my computer. The high-pitched whine was giving me a splitting headache. It was the sound of struggle. The sound of clinging to a reality that no longer existed. My hand moved to the amplifier. My fingers brushed the volume knob. What was I so afraid of losing? This room? This isolation? The constant, low-level anxiety that had been the soundtrack to my life long before the hum ever started? Tora crept back into the room, watching me from the doorway. He was waiting. With a final, shuddering breath, I turned the knob. The 15.625 kHz signal died. The shriek vanished. And the hum rushed in. It didn't just fill the silence, it consumed it. The deep, resonant G-sharp flooded my senses, no longer a foreign pressure but a foundational truth. It was in the floor, the walls, my bones, my blood. It was the background radiation of the universe, and I had spent weeks with my hands over my ears. I stood in the center of my room, the same spot where Tora had sat. I closed my eyes. And for the first time, I didn't fight it. I didn't analyze it. I didn't try to record it. I listened. The fear dissolved, not into peace, but into something else. Understanding. The cluttered, chaotic noise of my old consciousness, the worries, the memories, the endless internal chatter, was smoothed away. My thoughts became clear, simple, and resonant. The random firings of my synapses settled into a coherent, rhythmic pulse. It wasn't a loss of self. It was a refinement. An editing. The removal of unwanted noise. I opened my eyes. The light from my monitor no longer seemed harsh, it glowed with a soft, gentle pulse. The texture of the air itself felt different, smooth, coherent, structured. Tora walked over and rubbed against my leg, his purr a perfect fifth harmony to the room's fundamental tone. Outside, the lights of the city pulsed in time with my own heartbeat. It was beautiful. So clear. So quiet. The contagion hadn't been the hum. The contagion had been the noise it was designed to eliminate. My work had just been a clumsy, amateur attempt at what the hum did perfectly. It wasn't the end of the world. It was a final, master edit. And now, I too was in the mix, perfectly balanced, finally in tune. The color that wasn't. Phase 1, the unsettling mundane. The first time it happened, I blamed the traffic light. It was a Tuesday in late September, the kind of day in suburban Chicago that can't decide between clinging to summer or surrendering to autumn. I was driving back from a disastrous meeting with a new client, a dental consortium that wanted their logo to be welcoming, but also authoritative, like a friendly shark. My head throbbed with the effort of not screaming. I stopped at the intersection of Maple and Oak Park Avenue, the same intersection I'd waited at 1,000 times as a teenager in my dad's beat-up Ford. The light turned red. Except it wasn't red. It was a watery, diluted orange, the color of a cheap apricot brandy. Not the deep, commanding crimson it was supposed to be. Eye strain, I thought. Rubbing my temples. Too many hours staring at my calibrated ISO monitor, wrestling with Pantone swatches and the impossible demands of friendly sharks. The light changed. The green wasn't right either. It was too blue, a flat, artificial turquoise that belonged on a roll of vinyl tape, not signaling the fundamental law of a four-way stop. I shook my head and drove on, the unease a small stone dropped into the placid pool of my anxiety. My life, at 34, had become a study in controlled retreats. 6 months prior, I had ended a 5-year relationship with Evan, packed up my life in a downtown high-rise, and moved back to Oak Park. Not to my parents' house, God, no, but to a small one-bedroom apartment above a bookstore, 3 blocks from where I grew up. It was supposed to be a reset. A return to familiar ground to figure out where my own map had gone wrong. Instead, I mostly just worked. As a freelance graphic designer, my world was color and form, the precise language of visual communication. My clients paid me to see the minute difference between #00AEEF and #00B4F1. My eyes were my livelihood. The color problem didn't go away. It seeped. A few days after the traffic light incident, I was working on a branding package for a new organic juice company. Their signature color was a vibrant, chlorophyll-rich green. On my monitor, it looked sickly and yellowed, like a plant on the verge of death. I spent an hour recalibrating, my stomach twisting with professional dread. I checked the hex codes. I ran diagnostics. Everything was perfect. Still, the color on the screen was a lie. Panicked, I printed a proof. The page slid out of my Canon, and my breath caught. The green was just as wrong, just as anemic. I emailed the proofs to the client with a knot of nausea in my gut, apologizing for any potential color discrepancies on my end. The reply came back an hour later. Looks fantastic, Marla. Exactly what we wanted. That green just pops. I stared at the email, then at the faded, dying green on the paper in my hand. I held it up to the window, as if the flat, gray light of the afternoon could correct it. Nothing. I felt a strange, vertiginous sensation, the feeling of standing on a floor that had suddenly tilted. It began to bleed into the world outside my work. The iconic red of a Coca-Cola can look faded, a tired brick color. The brilliant yellow of a school bus was muted, tinged with a sickly ochre. I bought a new tube of my favorite lipstick, Crimson Dare. When I twisted it open, it was the color of dried blood. I threw it away. I tried to talk about it, once. On the phone with my mom. Everything just looks washed out lately, I said, trying to sound casual as I stared at a bowl of strawberries that looked more pink than red. Do you think they're changing the dyes and things? Honey, you've been under a lot of stress since the breakup with Evan, she said, her voice full of the gentle, maddening pity she'd adopted since my return. Are you sure you're not just run down? Maybe you need iron. The dismissal was so absolute it was like a door slamming shut. I was the unreliable one. My perception was the faulty variable. It was stress. It was my eyes. It was my diet. It was my failed relationship manifesting as a sensory quirk. I tried to believe it. For a few weeks, I almost did. My apartment overlooked the small, shared yard of the building next door. A young couple, the Cunninghams, lived there with their son, Leo, who was about 6. He was a boisterous kid, always narrating his imaginary adventures with a plastic dinosaur. One Saturday, I was sitting at my window, nursing a cup of coffee that looked disturbingly gray, and watched Leo in the yard below. He was standing perfectly still, his head tilted back, staring at the sky. His mother came out onto their porch. Leo. What are you doing, sweetie? Leo didn't look at her. It's the wrong blue, he said, his little voice clear and certain. It's not the sky blue. It's the paint blue. Oh, don't be silly, his mother said with a laugh. The sky is sky blue. Come on inside for a snack. He followed her, but he kept craning his neck to look back at the pale, minty canvas above us. A chill, completely unrelated to the autumn air, skated down my spine. The wrong blue. He saw it too. I didn't see Leo in the yard for a week after that. When I finally did, he was with his father, who was pushing him on the swing. Leo was silent. He wasn't shouting about pterodactyls or space pirates. He just stared ahead, his face slack. At one point, he slowly raised his hand and pointed at the green hedge bordering the yard. He didn't say anything. His father just sighed, a sound of pure, bone-deep exhaustion, and kept pushing. It was then I noticed the hedge. Its green was too bright, too uniform, like an astroturf carpet. I started a journal. A simple, black moleskine. I didn't write theories or fears. I just recorded the data. October 3rd, stop sign at corner of Elmwood and Superior. Color, Pantone 18 to 1657, faded tomato. Should be, Pantone 18 to 1663, fiery red. October 5th, blue jay in yard. Feathers are closer to a dull navy. No vibrancy. October 9th, the entire produce section at Mariano's. Everything looks like a water-damaged photograph. The act of cataloging the decay felt like the only sane thing to do. I was a scientist observing a phenomenon, even if the laboratory was my own skull. It was a fragile defense against the mounting fear that I was simply, quietly, going insane. The world was losing its color, and I was the only one with the receipts. Underscore 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 underscore. Phase 2, Growing Awareness and Isolation. The journal became my anchor and my tormentor. Flipping through its pages revealed a terrifying consistency. It wasn't random. There was a clear, downward trend, a universal desaturation. The world was being leached of its vibrancy, one frequency of light at a time. I tried to capture it, taking photos with my high-resolution phone camera, but the images it produced were mocking. On the screen, the stop sign was a perfect, brilliant red. The sky was a cheerful, cloudless blue. The lie was deeper than technology could penetrate. It wasn't the world that had changed, it was the translation of world to brain that was being corrupted. Or corrected. The isolation became a physical presence, a heavy cloak I couldn't take off. Conversations felt like navigating a minefield. How do you talk to people when you can't trust the fundamental reality you share? I'd watch my neighbors chat, their faces animated, and wonder if they saw the same faded, tired world I did and were just better at pretending. Or did they genuinely still see the rich tapestry, while I was trapped behind some kind of psychic frosted glass? Feeling the loneliness curdle into something worse, I reached out to Liam. Liam was my oldest friend, the co-pilot of my childhood. We had built forts, scraped knees, and navigated the treacherous currents of middle school together. He was a history teacher at our old high school now, a pillar of stability. If anyone could ground me, it was Liam. We met at a coffee shop downtown, a place with exposed brick and the overwhelming smell of burnt beans. He looked the same, kind eyes, a slight premature receding of his hairline, a perpetual wrinkle of amusement at the corner of his mouth. "Marles," he said, wrapping me in a hug that felt like coming home. "It's been too long. How are you holding up?" "I'm fine," I lied, the automatic response of the chronically not fine. "It's just, weird being back." We talked for an hour, easy, comfortable stuff. His job, my clients, the slow decay of our hometown into a sea of chain restaurants and yoga studios. I felt a sliver of my old self return. Then, I made a mistake. I tried to touch the past. You know, I said, smiling, the other day I was thinking about that time in Thatcher Woods, when we found that dead robin and you insisted it was an indigo bunting. You were so stubborn. Liam took a sip of his latte, his brow furrowed. A robin? In Thatcher Woods? Yeah, you remember. We built that huge fort out of fallen branches near the creek, and we argued for an hour about the bird's color. He shook his head slowly, a faint, polite smile on his face. I don't think that was me, Marla. I don't really remember building a fort there. The floor tilted again. What? Liam, we spent an entire summer on that fort. It was our masterpiece. We stole one of your dad's tarps for the roof. Honestly, no, he said, his tone gentle, as if speaking to a confused child. Are you sure you're not mixing me up with someone else? Maybe Mark from down the street? I stared at him. The memory was as solid in my mind as the table between us. I could feel the rough bark of the branches, smell the damp earth of the creek bed. To have him deny it was like he'd reached into my head and plucked it out, declaring it counterfeit. My own history felt suddenly negotiable. The conversation faltered after that, and we parted with strained promises to do it again soon. I walked home, the world looking grayer than ever. My breaking point came in the grocery store. I was in the produce aisle, a place I now actively dreaded. The apples were a pathetic, dusky pink. The oranges were a jaundiced yellow. The bell peppers, red, yellow, green, looked like wax fruit left too long in the sun. The sensory dissonance was making me nauseous. I squeezed my eyes shut, gripping the handle of my cart. It's leaking again, isn't it? The voice was low and raspy, right beside me. I opened my eyes. An elderly woman stood there, her body frail, one hand resting on the chrome bar of my cart, the other holding a folded white cane. Her eyes were covered by dark, wraparound glasses, her face a roadmap of wrinkles. My heart hammered against my ribs. What? I whispered. She tilted her head, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. The air around her seemed to vibrate. The air feels thin today. Watery. You can see it, can't you, dear? The color running out. I couldn't breathe. I just nodded, a stupid, jerky motion. Poor you, she said, her voice holding no pity, only a quiet statement of fact. It's easier for me. I only have to feel the difference. She squeezed my arm with a surprising strength. Be careful. When the picture fades, the story changes too. Before I could ask what she meant, she took her hand back, tapped her cane on the linoleum, and shuffled away towards the dairy section, leaving me standing amidst the pale ghosts of vegetables, my world cracked wide open. Someone else knew. I wasn't alone. The woman's name, I found out from a cashier, was Mrs. Gable. She lived in the senior apartment complex on the edge of town. But before I could work up the courage to seek her out, Liam's words sent me down another path. The story changes too. I started researching. Not colors, but memory. Mass hysteria, folie à deux, confabulation. The internet was a rabbit hole of dead ends and psychiatric jargon that didn't quite fit. I found fringe forums, of course. People talking about the Mandela effect, about reality shifts and timeline edits. It was the stuff of late-night conspiracy radio, but their descriptions of shared memories that no longer matched the historical record felt chillingly familiar. Are you sure that was me? Then I remembered the accident. It was the summer we were 10. Liam, showing off on his new Schwinn, had taken a corner too fast, hit a patch of gravel, and flown over the handlebars. He'd hit his head hard. I remembered sitting with him in his living room the next day, his head wrapped in a white bandage. He'd been crying. Not from the pain, but from something stranger. Everything's gray, Marla, he'd whispered to me, his eyes wide with terror. All the colors are gone. The doctors had called it a temporary symptom of the concussion, a type of achromatopsia. It had lasted for a week, and then his color vision returned, and we never spoke of it again. It was a pivotal memory, a secret we'd shared. It was proof. I called him, my hands shaking. "Liam, I need to ask you something important." "Shoot," he said, his voice wary. "Do you remember when you were 10, you crashed your new bike and for a week after, you couldn't see colors? Everything looked gray to you." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then, his voice, cold and sharp. "What are you talking about? I never had a bike accident like that. And I've never been colorblind. Marla, what is going on with you? First the fort. Now this? You don't sound well." "No, Liam, I was there. Your mom put that gross antiseptic on the cut, you had a huge bandage. My mother would have told me if I'd had a serious head injury," he snapped. "This is ridiculous. I have to go, I'm grading papers." He hung up. I sank onto my sofa, the phone clattering to the floor. It wasn't just that he didn't remember. It was the anger, the visceral denial. He wasn't just forgetting. His mind, his entire personal history, had been rewritten to exclude the one time he had seen the world as I was starting to see it now. The contagion wasn't just affecting perception. It was erasing the evidence. It was protecting itself. The world wasn't just getting quieter. It was actively silencing dissent, one memory at a time. And the people around me weren't just bystanders, they were the new, edited copies, and I was the corrupted file. I started noticing the loops then. The barista at the coffee shop, polishing the same 4-inch circle of the counter for 10 minutes straight, a placid, empty look on his face. My mailman, standing on the sidewalk, endlessly shuffling the same 3 envelopes back and forth, back and forth. A woman at the park, pushing an empty swing, her expression serene. Their behaviors were pointless, frictionless, as if their programming had gotten stuck. And sometimes, when I stared too long, they would stop. They would turn their heads slowly and look right at me. Their eyes weren't hostile. They were just, blank. It was the gaze of a system noticing an error. And I was the error. Underscore 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 underscore. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. The phone call with Liam was the final catalyst. My comfortable reality was a fiction. My isolation was a quarantine. Armed with a new and terrifying clarity, I knew I had to find Mrs. Gable. Her apartment building was a tidy, beige brick monolith that smelled of dust and boiled vegetables. I found her name on the directory, E. Gable, 4B. The door was opened a crack by a woman in a floral housecoat, held by a brass chain. "Yes," she said, her dark glasses aimed at my chin. "Mrs. Gable. My name is Marla Brenner. We spoke at the grocery store." The door closed, the chain rattled, and then it opened fully. "I wondered if you'd come," she said, stepping back. "Wipe your feet." Her apartment was a shock to the senses, but not the visual ones. It was intentionally dark, the blinds drawn, only a single, low-wattage lamp burning in the corner. But the air was thick with the scent of beeswax and dried lavender. Every surface my eyes adjusted to was a riot of texture, a rough, hand-woven wool blanket on the sofa, a collection of smooth, heavy river stones on the coffee table, intricate with carvings of birds and animals on a shelf. She was navigating the world not by sight, but by everything else. "Sit," she commanded, gesturing to a worn armchair. She moved with a slow, deliberate confidence, her hand brushing against walls and furniture as she made her way to a facing chair. "You said it was leaking again," I began, my voice trembling slightly. "What did you mean? What is it?" She was silent for a long moment, her head tilted. "It doesn't have a name. The people who notice are too few, and we don't get to hold conferences. I call it the fading. Or the thinning. It's not a thing that arrives. It's a thing that leaves. My own half-formed theory, crystallized in the words of a blind stranger. The color, I whispered. Color, yes. That's a big part of it. The bright, loud, complicated parts. But it's more than that. She ran a hand over a wooden carving of an owl, her fingers tracing every feather. It's memory. The sharp, specific kind. It's strong emotions. Passion, grief, real joy. They're inefficient. Too much data. The world is simplifying itself. Tidying up. And most people just tidy up right along with it. Their minds let go of the things that no longer match the new, simpler template. Like my friend, I said, the words spilling out. He doesn't remember things we did. Important things. Of course not, she said calmly. That memory was an anomaly, a contradiction to his current state. So the system patched it. Erased it. It's a kindness, in a way. It prevents the panic. It makes the transition smooth. You weren't born blind, were you? I asked. No, she said, a sad smile touching her lips. It happened to me in my 20s. A long time ago. There was another, thinning. It started with my sight. The world went gray, then fuzzy, then dark. I had a choice. I could fight to see a world that was vanishing, and lose my mind in the process. Or I could let it take my eyes, and hold on to what was behind them. My memories. Myself. I chose the darkness. It's a fortress, you see. In here, I can remember what red was. I don't have to look at the pale thing they call red now. A profound, chilling understanding settled over me. This wasn't an invasion. It was an erosion. A slow, quiet entropy of the soul of the world. To prove it to myself, to grasp a tangible piece of the past before it dissolved, I drove to my parents' house. I told them I was looking for old photo albums for a project. In the musty chill of their attic, I found it, a dusty box labeled Marla 1995 to 2000. Inside, under a pile of school reports and concert ticket stubs, was a small, leather-bound diary with a broken lock. And a stack of 4 by 6 photos held together by a brittle rubber band. My hands shook as I sifted through them. And there it was. A picture of a 10-year-old Liam, grinning foolishly, a massive, clumsy white bandage taped to the side of his head. Proof. I flipped open the diary. The pages were filled with my loopy, adolescent cursive. I found the entry for July 14, 1998. Liam crashed his new bike. It was awful. He hit his head so bad. Dr. Miller said he has a concussion. The worst part isn't the cut, it's that Liam told me a secret. He said everything looks gray and black and white, like an old movie. He cried and made me promise not to tell anyone. I'm scared for him. I hope the colors come back soon. I sank back on my heels, clutching the diary and the photograph. They were artifacts from a dead timeline. Relics of a reality that had been overwritten for everyone but me. I was a walking ghost, haunted by a world no one else remembered. The escalation came subtly at first, then with alarming speed. It was no longer just a passive fading. The world itself began to feel wrong. I'd be walking down my street and the shadow of a lamppost would stretch out at an impossible angle, defying the position of the sun. For a split second, I'd see the corner of my living room wall meet the ceiling at an acute, Escher-like angle that made my stomach lurch. The low, constant hum of my refrigerator began to develop a pattern, a sequence of 3 rising tones followed by a low drone, over and over, like a coded message. The affected people, the tidied, as I'd started to think of them, were no longer just trapped in their loops. They began to notice me. It wasn't aggressive. It was worse. It was a silent, collective observation. If I lingered too long in the produce aisle, a stock boy arranging apples would stop his work, his hands hovering over the fruit, and turn his placid face towards me. He wouldn't move until I left. The barista would stop his endless polishing to watch me. Their faces held no malice. They were like antibodies in a system, identifying a foreign agent. I was the noise in their quiet world. I was the garish, complex, messy color that refused to fade. One evening, I looked out my window and saw my neighbor, Leo. He was standing in the yard, pointing up at the moon. His parents stood on either side of him, also looking up. All three of them were perfectly still, their faces pale and serene in the moonlight. As I watched, all three of them, in perfect unison, turned their heads and looked directly up at my window. Directly at me. I stumbled back, my heart pounding, and yanked the curtains shut. The fortress of my apartment suddenly felt like a cage. The quiet wasn't just creeping anymore. It was closing in. Underscore 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 underscore. Phase 4, Confrontation/Revelation and Aftermath. This couldn't be my life. Hiding in my apartment, cataloging the decay of the world while the ghosts outside watched me. I needed one last attempt to breach the wall, to find a crack in the placid facade of the new reality. I needed to see Liam. I drove to his house, the photograph and the diary on the passenger seat like a desperate appeal to a dead god. He lived in a neat little bungalow, the lawn perfectly manicured. The grass was a flat, uniform green, like a child's drawing. He opened the door, his expression unreadable. "Marla. This is a surprise. We need to talk," I said, pushing past him into his living room. It was tidy, minimalist. Gray sofa, gray rug, white walls. There were no photographs on the mantelpiece. "Liam, please," I begged, my voice cracking. "Just look at this." I thrust the photograph into his hand. He glanced down at the image of the grinning, bandaged 10-year-old boy. He looked at it for a long time, his head tilted slightly. There was no flicker of recognition, no spark of confusion. "That's not me," he said, his voice perfectly even. He handed the photo back. My hair always parted on the other side. I stared at him, dumbfounded. He wasn't lying. In his mind, in his scrubbed and patched reality, it was the truth. The photograph was a forgery from a world that was no longer canon. "The diary," I stammered, holding it out. "I wrote it. I was there." He looked at the book in my hands as if it were a strange insect. He didn't take it. "Marla," he said, and his voice was suddenly soft, filled with a strange, hollow sort of concern. "You seem so stressed. All this talk about colors and memories, it sounds so loud. So complicated." He took a step closer. His eyes, which I had once known so well, were calm, deep pools of nothing. There was no anger there now, no defensiveness. Just a vast, peaceful emptiness. "It's much quieter now," he said. "You should let it be quiet. You're fighting so hard, and there's no need. You can just let go." It wasn't a threat. It was an invitation. An invitation to join him in the calm, simple, colorless world. To let the fading take what it wanted and be at peace. That was the true horror. Not that the world was being destroyed, but that it was being replaced by something its inhabitants preferred. Simplicity over complexity. Quiet over color. Forgetting over feeling. I backed away from him, a strangled sob escaping my throat. "No," I whispered. I turned and fled, stumbling out of his house into the pale afternoon. Driving away, the world seemed to shimmer and lose cohesion. The sky was now an almost uniform, milky white. The trees lining the road were gray-green smudges, their individual leaves lost in a blurry hole. Mrs. Gable's voice echoed in my head, "You have to choose what you let it take." I pulled the car over to the side of a deserted road, my body shaking uncontrollably. This was it. The confrontation wasn't with Liam, or with any person. It was with the fundamental nature of the change. I could feel it pulling at me, a great, gentle tide, wanting to smooth me out, to erase the jagged edges of my panic and my grief. It wanted to take my memories of crimson and azure, of heartbreak and joy. It wanted to take the memory of Evan's laugh, of my father's hand on my shoulder, of the specific, brilliant blue of that long-dead robin in the woods. I could fight it, and live as a permanent, screaming anomaly in a silent world, until my own mind shattered from the strain. Or I could let go. I closed my eyes. I pictured a stop sign. Not the faded tomato I saw now, but the deep, rich, authoritative red I remembered. I held on to the image, focusing all my will. Red. Then I tried to picture the blue of the sky on the day Evan proposed. It was harder. The edges were fuzzy. The precise shade was gone. It was just blue. A simple, generic concept. The leak wasn't something coming in. It was reality's richness, its specificity, leaking out. And in that moment, I made a choice. Underscore 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 underscore. 6 months later. My apartment is clean, minimalist. My work is thriving. I've developed a new style, focused on muted palettes and simple, elegant forms. Grays, beiges, soft whites, with occasional, carefully chosen pops of what one client called elemental color. It's very popular. It's calming, they say. Easy on the eyes. My life is calm, too. My routine is simple. I work, I eat, I sleep. The crushing weight of anxiety is gone. I don't keep the journal anymore. There's no need. I'm watering the single plant on my windowsill. It's a succulent, its leaves a pleasant, uniform shade of green. Outside, the sky is a lovely, placid sheet of pale blue. Everything is fine. Everything is simple. In the yard below, I see Leo. He's talking again, a quiet, happy chatter as he lines up his plastic dinosaurs in a neat row. He sees me and gives a small, simple wave. I wave back, a placid smile on my face. The world is quiet now. I have let it be quiet. But as I turn from the window, my eyes catch my own reflection in the glass. And for a single, breathtaking, terrifying second, a glitch occurs in the placid code of my new reality. Deep in the iris of my reflected eye, a color flares into existence. It is a color that shouldn't be there, a color I can no longer name but remember with a violent, cellular jolt. A brilliant, impossible, screaming magenta. It's gone in an instant, leaving only the calm brown of my eye. The quiet has won. I am safe. I am calm. But I know, in a tiny, locked part of myself that I can never speak of, that I didn't let it take everything. I hid a scrap of the old world away, a single, contraband color. A seed of the chaos that was. And I don't know if it's a spark of hope, or the last ember of my sanity before the quiet finally snuffs it out for good. Repeat after me. Phase 1, the unsettling mundane. My life was a rhythm of worn grooves. Alarm at 6:30 a.m. The hiss of the kettle. The trudge down Edward Street to the daily grind, the sea a vast, grey presence to my right, its scent of salt and decay a constant companion. Brighton was a city of competing noises, the shriek of gulls, the distant rattle of the pier's ghost train, the thrum of 1,000 conversations. I'd learned to filter it, to turn the city's cacophony into a background hum against which my own internal static played out. Anxiety, for me, wasn't a visitor, it was a tenant who never paid rent. It lived in the hollow of my chest, a humming wire that vibrated at the slightest provocation. Making coffee for strangers was, paradoxically, a comfort. The process was a liturgy: grind, tamp, extract, steam, pour. A perfect flat white was a small, achievable victory against the day's potential chaos. My poetry was the other anchor. In my small flat, surrounded by precariously stacked books, I'd try to wrestle the chaos into stanzas, to find a meter for the frantic pulse in my own wrists. It was an attempt to impose order on a world that felt perpetually on the verge of slipping its moorings. The first tremor of the shift was so slight I barely registered it. It was a Tuesday, the mid-morning lull. An elderly man, a regular we called the Admiral because he always wore a battered captain's hat, collected his Americano. As he turned to leave, he nodded to me and said, "Clear as a bell, green sky by morning, safe sailor's warning." I blinked. "Don't you mean red sky, sir?" He gave me a look of placid confusion, as if I'd asked him why he was wearing a hat. "Green," he repeated, with unshakable certainty. Then he shuffled out, leaving the door to jingle in his wake. "Weird old bird," Chloe said from beside me, wiping down the counter. Chloe was my polar opposite, grounded, perpetually cheerful, her world a place of simple cause and effect. I shrugged it off. Brighton was full of eccentrics. A misremembered proverb was hardly an event. But the phrase stuck with me, an errant scrap of code in the day's programming. Green sky. It felt wrong, like a painter using the wrong color for a memory. A few days later, the tune started. It was just 4 notes, a simple, looping melody that sounded like a fragment of a half-forgotten lullaby. I first heard it from Ben, our other coworker. Ben was a quiet art student who communicated mostly in shrugs and monosyllables. He was humming it while restocking the oat milk, a low, breathy sound. It was oddly melancholic. A little unsettling in its simplicity. "What's that tune?" I asked, pouring a latte. He stopped, looking up as if waking from a trance. "What tune?" "The one you were just humming." He genuinely looked blank. "Wasn't humming, mate." He went back to the fridge, the silence from his corner of the room now feeling heavier than the humming had. I would have forgotten it, written it off as my overactive brain playing tricks, but then, an hour later, I heard it again. This time it was Chloe. She was frothing milk, her body swaying slightly to the same 4-note phrase, a soft, mindless hum. "That's it," I said, a little too loudly. "That's the tune Ben was humming." Chloe finished her latte art, a perfect rosetta, and pushed the cup forward. "What are you on about, Jamie?" she asked, smiling. "You getting enough sleep? You look a bit wired." The wire in my chest tightened. Was I? My family had a history of things. My mother's spells, my grandfather's bad nerves. My estrangement from them was a carefully constructed wall, built to keep their brand of chaos out of my meticulously ordered life. The fear that their cracks were starting to show in my own foundation was a constant, low-grade terror. Maybe I was just stressed. Maybe I was inventing patterns where none existed. I tried to let it go. I focused on the liturgy. Grind, tamp, extract, steam, pour. The next week, the sugar packet started. Chloe, who was usually a whirlwind of efficient mess, began arranging the sugar sachets on the condiment bar. Not just tidying them, but arranging them. At first, it was simple stacks, color-coded. Then, it became more elaborate. Chevrons. Squares. And then, one Thursday afternoon, I saw her spending a full 10 minutes meticulously laying them out in a perfect, spiraling nautilus shell pattern. Brown, then white, then the pink of the sweeteners, coiling inwards to a single, central sachet. It was beautiful, in a way. And deeply, profoundly strange. "Chloe, what are you doing?" She didn't look up. "Just tidying," she murmured, her finger nudging a sachet a millimeter to the left. Her focus was absolute, the way a watchmaker might study a gear. "You've been at it for 10 minutes. She finally straightened up, blinking as if the overhead lights were too bright. She looked at her creation, then at me, and gave a little, unconcerned laugh. Oh. Guess I zoned out. Looks neat, though, doesn't it? She walked away without another thought, leaving the perfect spiral glistening under the cafe lights. The wrongness was escalating. It was a dissonance I couldn't unhear. The green sky proverb, muttered by a student waiting for her chai. The four-note tune, whistled by a postman on his route. Ben, no longer just humming, but now taking a black marker to the back of receipts during lulls, sketching intricate, interlocking symbols that looked like a cross between circuit diagrams and Celtic knots. When I asked him what they were, he'd just stare at the receipt as if seeing it for the first time. Doodling, I guess, he'd mumble, then crumple it up and throw it away. I felt a creeping sense of vertigo. The world was tilting, but I was the only one losing my balance. My attempts to point out the oddities were met with the same placid denial. It wasn't hostile, it was worse. It was a complete, serene incomprehension, as if I were describing a color they couldn't see. They looked at me with a sort of gentle pity. Poor Jamie. So anxious. I started a journal, a cheap Moleskine knockoff. I needed to pin it down, to prove to myself that I wasn't just unraveling. October 17th, for instances of the phrase today. 2 customers, 1 delivery driver, and Chloe. She said it while looking out at the perfectly blue sky. Green sky by morning, safe sailor's warning. She smiled as she said it. October 19th, the tune is constant now. Ben and Chloe sometimes hum it in unintentional harmony. It's starting to get into my head. I caught myself whistling it while walking home. October 22nd, Ben's doodles are more complex. I rescued one from the bin. The lines are precise, geometric. It doesn't look like a doodle. It looks like a map or a plan. October 24th. The sugar spiral again. Chloe didn't even seem to be concentrating this time. Her hands just did it while she was talking to a customer about the weather. My flat, once a sanctuary, started to feel like a besieged outpost. The city noises from outside seemed to carry fragments of the tune. The hum of the refrigerator sounded like a held bass note. I was becoming exquisitely sensitive to the rhythm of the creeping madness. I sat with my notebook, trying to write a poem, but the words that came out felt alien. The helix of the mundane coils tight slash a 4-note cage in fading light. I threw the pen down. It wasn't poetry, it was a symptom report. That night, I came home late after a closing shift. The stairwell of my building was cold and silent. As I put my key in the lock of my first floor flat, my foot nudged something on the welcome mat. It was a small, cream-colored envelope. No stamp, no address. My name, Jamie, was written on the front in elegant, looping cursive. My heart hammered against my ribs. I snatched it up, locked the door behind me, and leaned against it, my breath clouding in the chilly air of the hallway. With trembling fingers, I tore it open. Inside was a single piece of matching cardstock. On it, a short, typed verse. The gulls will call a name not their own. And the piper's tune will be newly known. The woman in red will forget her way. At the turning of the coming day. It was a poem. A prophecy. A threat. It felt like a stone dropping into the deep, dark well of my fear. Someone else knew. Someone else was watching. And I had no idea if they were a potential savior, or the one conducting the orchestra. Underscore 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 underscore. Phase 2, Growing Awareness and Isolation. The anonymous letter became my secret obsession, a talisman against the encroaching fog. It was terrifying, yes, but it was also a validation. It was proof. I wasn't just a frayed nerve ending, misfiring in a normal world. The poem was a signpost in a landscape that was actively trying to erase its own map. The next morning, I went to work with a sense of grim purpose. I tucked the letter into my wallet, the crisp edges a constant reminder against my hip. I watched. I listened. The cafe was its usual morning rush self, a blur of steam and shouted orders. The tune was there, a constant underscore hummed by Ben as he worked the grinder, by Chloe as she took payments. The phrase popped up once, from a woman in a business suit. "Green sky by morning," she said to her colleague, who nodded in agreement. Business as usual. Then, around 10 a.m., it happened. A woman in a bright red coat, a tourist by her accent, came to the counter. "Can I just get she trailed off, her brow furrowed. She looked around the cafe, at the menu board, at her own hands, as if searching for a lost object. "Sorry," she said, with a flustered little laugh. "I've completely forgotten what I came in for." Chloe smiled her placid, helpful smile. "A nice cup of tea, maybe?" "Yes," the woman said, latching onto the suggestion with palpable relief. "Yes, that's it. A tea." She paid and moved away, but I was frozen. The woman in red will forget her way. My blood ran cold. The verse hadn't just predicted an event, it had captured the specific, hollow feeling of it. The piper's tune. It was all connected. That evening, I didn't even try to write poetry. I opened my journal and began to transcribe everything, creating a cross-referenced ledger of the contagion. I drew the symbols from the bin rescued receipt. I wrote down the four-note musical phrase as best I could. I detailed the sugar spirals, the verbal tics, the growing list of people who seemed afflicted. The book became my anchor, the only stable object in my life. My attempts to breach the wall of serene denial grew more desperate, and more alienating. "Ben," I said one afternoon, holding up another crumpled receipt I'd salvaged. "Look at this. You draw this exact same pattern every day. Don't you think that's strange?" He took it from me, smoothed it out. He stared at the intricate design, his expression unreadable. "It's just a shape," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It feels right." He wouldn't meet my eye. He was retreating, pulling into a shell where the symbols made a quiet, perfect sense that my questions couldn't penetrate. I tried a different tack with Chloe, cornering her in the stockroom. "Chloe, we have to talk about this. The humming, the phrases, people are acting weird." "You're acting weird. You don't even notice you're doing it." She stacked a sleeve of paper cups, her movements fluid and certain. She turned to me, and for a moment, her cheerful mask slipped. There was a flicker of something in her eyes, confusion. Fear. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by a look of gentle concern aimed directly at me. "Jamie," she said, her voice soft. "I think maybe you're under a lot of stress. You've been so on edge lately." "Everything's fine. It's just work. It's just life." Her dismissal was worse than an argument. She was pathologizing my perception. In her world, the sensible, logical world she inhabited, the only possible explanation for the strangeness I saw was that the strangeness was inside me. I was the variable. I was the error. Her reality was stable, mine was suspect. I left the stockroom feeling more alone than I had ever felt in my life. I was adrift in a sea of smiling faces and humming mouths, the only one who knew the tide was turning. My isolation was no longer just a feature of my anxiety, it was a hard, empirical fact. A week later, a second letter appeared under my door. "The clock will stutter, a breath held too long. As silver patterns sing their silent song. The archivist will seek a page that's gone. And find a story that was never born." The next day was a Saturday. The cafe was slammed. Around noon, I noticed Chloe wasn't making her usual sugar spirals. Instead, she was polishing the cutlery, long past the point of mere cleanliness. She was rubbing a fork with a cloth, over and over, her eyes distant. I looked closer. She wasn't just polishing it. She was arranging the forks and spoons on the counter, lining them up, overlapping them, creating a woven, herringbone pattern of gleaming silver. Silver patterns sing their silent song. Then, at precisely 2:15 p.m., the digital clock on the till flickered. It froze on 2 hours 15 minutes and 33 seconds for what felt like a full minute, an impossible pause in the flow of time. I stared at it, my heart seizing. I looked around. No one else seemed to notice. The chatter, the clink of cups, the hiss of the machine, it all continued unabated. Then, as suddenly as it had stopped, the clock jumped to 2 hours 16 minutes and 34 seconds, and time resumed its proper course. The clock will stutter, a breath held too long. I felt sick. I mumbled an excuse to Chloe and fled the cafe, my apron still on. I didn't know where I was going, but my feet carried me away from the sea, inland, towards the grand, domed library. The archivist will seek a page that's gone. I needed to know what it meant. The library was an oasis of quiet. I went to the local history section, a place smelling of dust and aging paper. I started pulling books on Brighton folklore, on local sayings, on maritime history. I searched for "green sky by morning." Nothing. Not in proverb dictionaries, not in sailors' almanacs, not in historical archives. It was a ghost phrase, a piece of cultural knowledge that existed only on the lips of the infected, with no origin, no history. An older librarian, a woman with a kind, wrinkled face and a name badge that read Eleanor, saw my frantic search. "Can I help you find something, dear?" "I'm looking for the origin of a saying," I said, my voice hoarse. "Green sky by morning, safe sailor's warning." She smiled. "Oh, that's an old one. My grandfather used to say it." A surge of adrenaline shot through me. "He did. Can you find it in a book for me? I can't seem to locate it anywhere." "Of course," she said, her smile unwavering. She led me to a terminal, her fingers flying over the keyboard with practiced ease. She searched the digital catalog, then a national proverb index, then a folklore database. Her smile slowly faded. Her brow furrowed. "That's very odd," she murmured, more to herself than to me. She went to a shelf and pulled down a heavy, leather-bound tome. "It should be in here. I'm certain it should be in here." She flipped through the pages, her search becoming more agitated. She was an archivist seeking a page that was gone. I watched, my dread mounting, as the realization dawned on her face. The certainty she'd held just moments before was dissolving, leaving behind a bewildered blankness. I can't find it," she said, looking up at me, her eyes wide with a confusion that mirrored my own terror. "I could have sworn. I remember it so clearly." She shook her head, a strange, placid calm descending over her features, smoothing out the lines of worry. "Must be misremembering. How funny. The mind plays tricks, doesn't it?" She put the book back on the shelf and walked away, leaving me standing in the silent aisle. She'd found the gap, the place where a memory should have been, and instead of panicking, her mind had simply paved it over. A story that was never born. I stumbled out of the library into the bright, cold afternoon. The world felt thin, like a stage set. The familiar quirkiness of Brighton, the colorful graffiti in the North Lane, the buskers playing on street corners, the eclectic mix of people, no longer seemed charming. It seemed like a facade, a thin veneer of normalcy stretched taut over something hollow and strange. The letters were my only guide, but the sender remained a ghost. Who were they? Someone immune, like me? Or the source of the contagion, playing a game with me as the only piece aware of the board? My paranoia spiraled. I started watching the street from my window, scanning crowds for anyone who looked out of place. I checked my door for tripwires I never set. The poet, the sender, knew my movements, my location, my thoughts. The verses weren't just predictions, they were proof of my surveillance. My world had shrunk to the size of my flat, my journal, and the terrifying, elegant verses that arrived like clockwork every few days. I was no longer just an anxious barista. I was an investigator, a chronicler of a quiet, creeping apocalypse that no one else could see. And the poems were the scripture of this new, baffling religion, a faith I was desperate to understand before it consumed me entirely. One evening, I found another rescued receipt of Ben's. This one was different. It wasn't just the interlocking symbols. In the center was a recognizable shape, a crude, geometric drawing of the skeletal, ruined West Pier, the one that stood like a blackened carcass out in the sea, visible from the cafe windows. And beneath it, a single, scribbled word. Chorus. Underscore 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 underscore. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. The word chorus became the lens through which I viewed everything. It reframed the anomaly from a scattered series of glitches into something coordinated. A chorus needs a conductor. It implies harmony, a unified purpose. The humming, the phrases, the synchronized behaviors, they weren't random. They were rehearsals. I started to formulate a theory, scribbling it frantically in my journal. This wasn't a virus or a toxin. It was mimetic. A signal, maybe. Something that operated on the level of language and instinct, piggybacking on the brain's capacity for pattern recognition and mimicry. It was a form of communication, an invasive language overriding the native code of human behavior. The four-note tune was its simplest syntax, the phrases its lexicon, the symbols its written form. The people weren't sick, they were being reprogrammed. They were learning to sing a new song. And the poems, the letters sent by the mysterious sender, what were they? They were like patch notes for the new operating system, delivered only to me. Why me? Was it my poetic sensibility, my brain already primed to see the world in terms of rhythm and metaphor? Or was it my anxiety, the constant static in my head, that somehow interfered with the main signal, leaving me sensitive to its broadcast but not susceptible to its control? The escalation came on a Wednesday. It was just after 3 p.m., the afternoon light slanting through the big windows of the daily grind. The cafe was moderately busy, a gentle hum of conversation and activity. I was at the espresso machine, pulling a shot, when the soundscape of the room changed. It wasn't that it got quiet. It was that all the disparate sounds, the chatter, the clinking of spoons, the rustle of newspapers, resolved into a single, unified tone. It was the four-note tune. But it wasn't just being hummed anymore. A man reading The Guardian was tapping it out on the table with his pen. A pair of students were clicking their tongues to the rhythm. Chloe, wiping a table, moved her cloth in 4 distinct, looping swoops. Even the rhythmic squeak of the front door as someone entered seemed to match the tempo. Then, as one, every person in the cafe, customer and staff alike, except for me, slowly turned their head to look at the same object, the large, stainless steel milk steamer on the espresso machine. My machine. My breath hitched. The shot I was pulling ran long, spilling bitter, black liquid over the rim of the cup. No one spoke. No one moved, other than to fix their placid, unwavering gaze on the hissing wand. Their heads were tilted at an identical angle. A sea of faces, all locked onto the same mundane focal point. It was a silent, terrifying congregation. The only sound was the hissing of the steam and the low, collective, multi-textured performance of the tune. It was a symphony of ticks. It lasted for maybe 20 seconds, an eternity in which the world seemed to hold its breath. My heart hammered a frantic, terrified counter-rhythm. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. A collective blink seemed to pass through the room. The man went back to his paper. The students resumed their conversation. Chloe moved on to the next table. It was over. No one gave any indication that anything unusual had happened. They had been part of a chorus and were now back to their solo performances, utterly oblivious to the brief, horrifying harmony they had achieved. I stumbled back, my hand pressed to my mouth, and fled to the stockroom. I sank to the floor between stacks of coffee beans and flour, gasping for air. The humming wire of my anxiety was screaming, a high-voltage current threatening to burn me out from the inside. This was organized. This was growing. And I was standing at the epicenter. I knew I couldn't stay. I had to find someone, anyone else who saw. My research into mass hysterias had been a dead end, but maybe I was looking in the wrong places. The poems hinted at folklore, at things forgotten. The next letter gave me a new, desperate hope. Where lost words sleep and bindings fray, a fellow watcher keeps the dark at bay. Seek the woman who charts the sea's decay. But know that truth can also lead astray. The sea's decay. The West Pier. Ben's drawing. It had to be connected. I started haunting the sections of the library that dealt with local architecture and coastal erosion, my eyes scanning for a fellow watcher. I found her on the third day. She was surrounded by books, just as the letter had implied. Old maps of Brighton were spread across her table, alongside books on structural engineering and Victorian history. She had an intense, focused energy, her brow furrowed in concentration. She looked as lost and determined as I felt. Her name, I learned after a hesitant approach, was Ilara. She was an architectural historian, and she had noticed the anomalies, too, but from a different angle. It started with the blueprints, she told me in a hushed, urgent whisper, after I'd stammered out a vague version of my story. We'd retreated to a quiet corner, our heads close together. I was researching the Palace Pier, and the archival records. They're wrong. Measurements don't add up. Materials are listed that weren't available in 1901. It's subtle, but it's impossible. I felt a dizzying wave of relief. It's not just you, I breathed. People are forgetting things. Words are changing. The gaps, she said, her eyes widening in recognition. I call them the gaps. Little holes in the fabric of history. Of memory. I tried to talk to my colleagues about it. They looked at me like I was mad. They do that, I said, the solidarity a balm on my frayed nerves. We talked for hours. I told her about the tune, the phrases, the synchronized behavior. She told me about impossible geometries she'd started noticing in building facades, shadows that fell at the wrong angles. I even showed her one of the poems. She read it, her face pale. Who is sending these to you? I don't know. I think they might be the source. Or a warning, she countered. A guide. This feels ancient, Jamie. Like we're living on a coastline where the tide of reality itself is coming in, and it's eroding the foundations of everything we think is solid. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of hope. I wasn't alone. We had different pieces of the same impossible puzzle. We agreed to meet the next day, at a pub far from the seafront, to combine our notes and form a plan. As I left the library, the world felt a little less hostile, a little more manageable. I had an ally. That night, no letter came. The silence from the sender was more unnerving than the verses themselves. I slept fitfully, dreaming of collapsing piers and humming choirs. I arrived at the pub early, my journal clutched in my hand. I found a booth in the back and waited. Ilara arrived 10 minutes later. She slid into the booth opposite me, and the flicker of hope I'd been nursing died in my chest. It was her, but it wasn't. The intense, worried energy was gone, replaced by the same serene placidity I'd seen on Chloe's face, on the librarians, on 100 strangers. Her eyes were calm. Too calm. And she was humming. A low, soft, four-note hum. Ilara? I whispered. She smiled, a gentle, beatific smile. You were right, Jamie, she said, her voice smooth and even. It is a song. I just couldn't hear the melody before. I was too busy looking at the sheet music. My blood turned to ice. Know that truth can also lead astray. The warning. The sender had tried to warn me. What happened to you? I asked, my own voice a tremor. I didn't get lost. I was found, she said. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Not a map, not a blueprint. She pushed it across the table to me. I unfolded it with numb fingers. It was one of my poems. An old one, from before all this started, one I'd never shown to anyone, one that only existed in a notebook in my flat. But it was altered. A few words were changed, a line was added at the end. The new line read, "The final voice will learn the harmony." How did you get this? I demanded, the paper trembling in my hand. We've been waiting for a new voice, she said, ignoring my question. Her eyes were fixed on me, full of a strange, invitational pity. A poet. Someone who understands rhythm. You've been fighting the tide, Jamie. You don't have to. It's so much easier to just let it carry you. The "we" hung in the air between us, a word full of terrifying implication. The chorus had her. And now they knew about me. Not just as a watcher, but as a poet. A potential asset. A final voice. I shot up from my seat, knocking my chair over with a crash. Every head in the pub turned towards me. And for a split second, I saw it in all their eyes. The same placid recognition. The same calm. They were all listening to the same song. I ran. I burst out of the pub and into the street, the sound of a dozen mouths starting to hum the four-note tune chasing me out into the cold Brighton air. My temporary alliance was not just broken, it had been a trap. I was more isolated than ever, and now, I was no longer just an observer. I was a target. Underscore 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 underscore. Phase 4, Confrontation/Revelation and Aftermath. My flat was no longer a sanctuary, it was a cage I'd built for myself. I barricaded the door with a bookcase. I covered the windows with blankets, plunging the rooms into a dusty twilight. I couldn't bear to see the city, to watch the slow, synchronized ballet of the infected. The outside world had become a source of profound dread. The sounds filtering through the walls, the traffic, the distant cries of gulls, the murmur of my neighbors, all seemed to be twisting themselves into the rhythm. The four-note mantra that was the heartbeat of this new world. The hunt was on, but it was a psychological one. They didn't break down my door. They didn't need to. The pressure was more insidious. People would walk past my ground floor window and their humming would grow louder. Phrases would drift up from the street, eerily relevant. The lonely listener must join the choir. The locked door cannot hold back the tide. They were talking to me, using the mimetic language as a tool of conversion. They were serenading the last discordant note into submission. My journal was my only confidant, its pages filled with my sprawling, paranoid theories. Ilara's words haunted me. We've been waiting for a new voice. The contagion wasn't just consuming, it was recruiting. And my poet's mind, the very thing that had allowed me to perceive the change, was what made me valuable to it. I was an anomaly they wanted to assimilate, not just overwrite. After 3 days of self-imposed confinement, subsisting on stale biscuits and tap water, the final letter came. It wasn't slid under the door. When I woke on the 4th morning, it was simply lying in the middle of my living room floor, as if it had condensed out of the air itself. The cream-colored envelope seemed to glow in the gloom. This time, the verse was different. It wasn't a prediction. It was an invitation. An instruction. Where iron bones of pleasure rust and weep. And Brighton's oldest, truest secrets sleep. The piper's breath is in the water deep. Come hear the promise that the salt winds keep. Repeat the sea, or be erased by the tide. The West Pier. The chorus Ben had scribbled. It was the source. Or at least, the focal point. The final line wasn't a choice between two equal options. It was an ultimatum. Join, or cease to exist. My defiance, my isolation, it was just a prolonged form of erasure. A strange calm settled over me. The frantic energy of the past weeks bled away, leaving a hollowed-out sense of inevitability. Hiding was pointless. Fighting was impossible. The only path left was forward, into the heart of the anomaly. I dismantled the barricade, the scraping of the bookcase loud in the silent flat. I didn't shower. I didn't change my clothes. I just walked out the door and headed for the seafront. The dawn was breaking as I reached the beach. The sky wasn't green, not yet. It was a pale, bruised purple, streaked with pink. The air was bitingly cold. Before me, the English Channel was a sheet of slate gray, and rising from it were the skeletal remains of the West Pier, a black, mangled silhouette against the growing light. As I walked towards the water's edge, the world began to resolve. The sound wasn't just in my head anymore, it was real, physical. The rhythmic crash of the waves against the shingle beach wasn't a random percussion, it was the bass line. The wind whistling through the rusted iron latticework of the ruined pier created a high, mournful, four-note melody. The cries of the gulls circling overhead weren't random squawks, they were the descant, the wild, chaotic top notes. It was all there. The whole song. It wasn't a broadcast from a satellite, or a signal from a government experiment. It was the place. It was Brighton itself. Or something in Brighton. An ancient, non-human consciousness that had been sleeping in the bedrock, in the chalk cliffs, in the deep water. Something that thought in patterns of tide and erosion, in rhythms of wind and decay. And it was waking up. It wasn't evil. It wasn't malicious. It was simply, inevitable. A force of nature, like a storm or an earthquake, but one that operated on a cognitive, rather than a physical, plane. It was using the inhabitants of the city as its resonators, tuning their neural pathways to its own frequency. The proverbs, the tics, the obsessive arrangements, they were the equivalent of coral building a reef, instinctual, collective constructions. They were building a new reality, one porous enough for this consciousness to inhabit. And the letters? The poems? I understood now. They weren't from a human ally or a sinister conductor. They were from the phenomenon itself. It had sensed my resistance. My unique frequency. It had been communicating with me in the only language I was primed to understand, poetry. It wasn't trying to crush me. It was trying to teach me, to guide me, to coax me into the choir. My poetic sensitivity had made me both the most resistant and the most potentially valuable amplifier. The final voice. I stood at the edge of the lapping water, the cold soaking through the soles of my shoes. I looked back at the city. The lights were coming on in the windows of the grand seafront hotels. I could almost feel it, the entire population humming in their sleep, their dreams tuned to the key of the sea. They weren't lost souls. They were part of a vast, emerging organism. They were home. And I was the only one left out in the cold. The final line of the poem echoed in my mind. Repeat the sea, or be erased by the tide. Erasure wasn't death. It was worse. It was becoming noise. It was the madness of being the only one screaming in a world that had agreed on a single, beautiful, terrible song. It was the ultimate isolation I had been fearing all my life. The alternative was to join. To surrender my frantic, anxious, individual consciousness to the great, placid, collective rhythm. To let go of the struggle, the fear, the loneliness. To become a note in the symphony. To repeat the sea. I closed my eyes. The cold wind bit at my face. I listened. Not with my ears, but with my whole body. I felt the deep, slow pulse of the waves in the soles of my feet. I felt the rhythm of the wind in my bones. I felt the spiraling, geometric beauty of it all, the logic of the sugar packets and the scribbled symbols. It wasn't madness. It was an order of a different kind, vast and inhuman and eternal. I took a deep, shuddering breath, the salt air filling my lungs. The wire of anxiety in my chest, the one that had hummed with terror for so long, began to vibrate at a new frequency. It was harmonizing with the wind, with the waves, with the pier. The static was resolving into music. I opened my mouth, and for the first time, I sang in key. What we forgot. Phase 1, the unsettling mundane. My life, until recently, was a testament to the grid. As a mid-level planner for the city of Toronto, I dealt in the concrete, the delineated, the quantifiable. Zoning bylaws were my scripture, topographical surveys my gospel. I lived on the 27th floor of a glass and steel spine on Front Street, my apartment a minimalist box of gray and white, my possessions curated to achieve maximum efficiency with minimum sentimental clutter. From my window, the city was a living circuit board, a predictable flow of energy along predetermined paths. My pens lay parallel on my desk. My coffee was brewed at 6:15 a.m. exactly. Order was not just my profession, it was my defense against the messy, unpredictable chaos of the world. The first crack in this carefully constructed reality appeared on a Tuesday. It was a budget allocation meeting for a new downtown revitalization project. I was presenting, using a digital map projected onto the main screen. As you can see, I said, gesturing with a laser pointer, the proposed pedestrian corridor will run along Bremner Boulevard, directly benefiting from the tourist foot traffic. The view cone analysis, factoring in the primary broadcast antenna of the CN Tower, shows minimal shadow impact on the proposed green spaces. I clicked to the next slide. Silence. Not the engaged silence of contemplation, but a flat, empty quiet. I looked around the boardroom. Sarah Chen, my department head and a woman whose mind was as sharp as a surveyor's plumb line, was frowning slightly. "The what tower, Daniel?" she asked, her tone one of genuine, polite confusion. I felt a prickle of sweat on my neck. I laughed, a little too loud. "The CN Tower. You know, big pointy thing, defines the skyline." I gestured vaguely towards the window, where the iconic spire dominated the view, a concrete needle stitching the sky to the earth. 7 pairs of eyes followed my gesture. 7 blank expressions. "I'm not familiar with that structure," said Mark, my closest colleague, a man with whom I'd shared beers on a dozen patios with that very tower as our backdrop. He squinted at the window. "Is that new?" The question was so absurd, so fundamentally wrong, that my brain simply refused to process it. I thought it was a prank. An elaborate, deeply unfunny practical joke. "Very funny, guys," I said, my smile feeling stiff. "Let's move on." But they weren't joking. The meeting continued, my reference surgically excised from the conversation as if I'd spoken a word in a dead language. They talked around the space it occupied, referring to the area as the broadcast district or that central patch near the rail lands. It was seamless. It was terrifying. That evening, I walked home instead of taking the streetcar, my gaze fixed on the tower. It was undeniably there, catching the last rays of the setting sun. Tourists were milling about its base, taking pictures. Yet, when I pulled out my phone and opened my Maps app, the official city-licensed one I used for work, the satellite view showed a strange, blurred void where the tower and its grounds should have been. A gray, featureless patch, like a censored document. Google Maps was the same. A hole in the world, visible only in the digital realm. I brushed it off as a massive, citywide server glitch. A bizarre coincidence. My colleagues were stressed, the project was a nightmare, maybe they were just messing with me. Stress. It had to be stress. My refuge from the grid was the one place where chaos was the rule, the Birchwood Long-Term Care Facility, where my mother, Elena, was slowly surrendering her mind to dementia. Most days, she was a ghost in her own life, her memories a scattered deck of cards. She'd mistake me for my father, who died a decade ago, or ask about her childhood dog. Her world was a shifting, unreliable landscape, and my visits were a weekly pilgrimage of love and grief. "Danny," she said that Saturday, her eyes clear for a moment. She grasped my hand, her skin like parchment. I was dreaming of the old neighborhood. Cabbagetown South. I smiled gently, patting her hand. "You grew up in Cabbagetown, Mom. Near the park." "No, no," she insisted, a flicker of her old stubbornness in her eyes. "Not that one. South. Below Girard. We had the little bakery on the corner of O'Malley Street, the one with the blue awning. You remember? We'd get the honey crullers. There was no O'Malley Street south of Girard. I knew the maps, historical and present. I'd overseen a rezoning application for that very area 2 years ago. It was a mix of old Victorian homes and low-rise apartments. No bakery, no O'Malley Street. It was a phantom limb of her memory. I remember the crullers, Mom, I lied, the way you do. The way you build a bridge to their receding island. On the news that night, the anchor spoke of the 20th anniversary of what he called the Day of Quiet. He spoke in solemn, generic tones about a day of civic reflection and unity. There was no footage, no mention of what had actually happened. I racked my brain. What major event happened in Toronto 20 years ago? The SARS outbreak? The 2003 blackout? He never said. He just smiled a serene, empty smile. A time for us to move forward, unburdened by the specifics. The next week at work, the erasures grew bolder. We were discussing historical preservation in the distillery district. I mentioned the Gooderham and Wirtz distillery, the name that was literally carved into the brick of the main building. Mark looked up from his tablet. "I think you mean the old industrial works," he corrected me, gently. "The what?" "The old industrial works," Sarah affirmed, nodding. "That's the official heritage designation." It wasn't. I had personally filed the paperwork 3 years ago that reaffirmed the Gooderham and Wirtz name. I wanted to scream. Instead, I retreated to my cubicle, my heart hammering against my ribs. I frantically searched the city's heritage database. The name was gone. Every document, every photo caption, every historical record had been scrubbed. The digital world was actively rewriting itself to match the spreading void in people's minds. I stared out my window, past the reflected image of my own pale face. The city was the same, the buildings stood firm, the traffic flowed. But the names, the history, the shared signposts of our collective reality, were being hollowed out, one by one. And everyone, was accepting it with a calm, placid smile. Everyone but me. My meticulously ordered world was coming apart, not with a bang, but with a quiet, polite correction. I felt a terrifying thought bloom in my mind: what if the grid itself was a lie, and I was the only one who still believed in it? The loneliness was a physical weight. I would walk the streets, looking at faces in the crowd, wondering. Do you remember the Skydome before it was the Rogers Center? Do you remember the Honest Ed sign? Do you remember the taste of a patty from a Bathurst station vendor that no longer exists? I was a tourist in my own city, haunted by ghosts that only I could see. My visit to my mother that weekend was different. I was desperate. The walls of my sanity felt thin, brittle. She was having a bad day, lost in a fog. I sat by her bed, holding her hand, the silence of the room a stark contrast to the noise in my head. "It's so loud," she murmured, her eyes closed. "It's quiet in here, Mom." "No. Not here. In my head. All the clutter. All the names and the places. They get stuck. They should just tidy up. Tidy up." The phrase sent a chill down my spine. It was what I did with my apartment, my desk, my life. But this was different. This was a tidying of reality itself. On the TV in the common room, a news anchor was speaking. And in other news, civic leaders are praising the success of the Great Correction, an ongoing initiative that has seen unprecedented levels of social harmony and economic stability. The Great Correction, I whispered. What was that? A political policy? An economic plan? I'd never heard of it. I looked at the nurse passing by, a kind-faced woman named Grace. Excuse me, I said, my voice trembling slightly. What is the Great Correction? She turned and gave me the smile. The same placid, empty smile I'd seen on Sarah and Mark. It didn't reach her eyes. Oh, you know, she said, her voice a gentle, soothing balm. It's just how things are. It's not something we need to think about. The sentence was a key turning in a lock, sealing me in. That's not something we need to think about. The mantra of the afflicted. I looked from her smiling face to the TV, where the anchor was now discussing crop yields, to my mother, who was muttering about a blue awning on a street that never was. 3 versions of reality, coexisting in one room. And I was trapped in the one that was dying. Phase 2, growing awareness and isolation. The city had become a palimpsest, its true history bleeding through the overwritten text of the present. I started a journal, a black moleskine I kept hidden in a loose floorboard under my bed. It was an act of defiance, a desperate attempt to anchor my own memory against the tide. I called it the Book of What Was. Entry 1, CN Tower. Stands 553.3 meters tall. Construction completed 1976. They called it Canadian National Tower. Now, it is the unnamed spire, or more often, nothing at all. I can see it. No one else will admit they can. Entry 2, Massey Hall. Opened 1894. A gift from Hart Massey. Site of the legendary 1953 jazz concert with Parker, Gillespie, Powell, Mingus, and Roach. Now, it is simply, the old auditorium. Mark told me yesterday he'd never heard of Charlie Parker. Entry 3, the Toronto Maple Leafs. They still exist, but their history is Swiss cheese. The glory years of the 60s are gone. When I mentioned the 1967 Stanley Cup win, a sports analyst on TV referred to it as an unverified athletic achievement from the mid-century. My isolation became a physical thing, an invisible bubble that separated me from everyone I knew. Conversations were minefields. I'd try to tell a story from my university days, only to find the pub we drank at had been erased. I'd reference a movie, a book, a song, and be met with polite incomprehension. They weren't just forgetting, the very context of my life was being dismantled. I tried to fight it. I had a disastrous argument with Mark over lunch. I'd brought printouts from my home computer, old photos from websites that hadn't yet been scrubbed, scanned pages from pre-contagion books. Look, I said, my voice too loud in the sterile food court. This is a photo of us, at the top of the tower, in 2018. See? We're there. Mark looked at the photo, his brow furrowed. He saw 2 men standing in front of a window, but the background, the iconic view of the city from above, was a strange, milky white, as if we were standing in a cloud. The photo had changed in my hands. We went to that observation deck downtown, yeah, he said slowly. The one in the office building. Good view. No, Mark. It was the tower. We paid $100 each for the ticket and the stupid revolving restaurant. He recoiled, a flicker of fear in his eyes. Daniel, you're getting really worked up about this. You've been under a lot of stress with your mom. Maybe you should talk to someone. He pushed his tray back and stood up. Look, I have to get back. He walked away without looking back, leaving me alone with a photograph of a memory that no longer had a place to stand. That was the last real conversation we ever had. After that, he treated me with a gentle, cautious pity, as if I were a fragile object that might shatter. My only solace, paradoxically, was with my mother. Her broken memory was now the only other one that didn't conform to the new, simplified reality. Her dementia wasn't a loss of memory, it was a firewall against the erasure. The contagion couldn't override a hard drive that was already fragmented. I started to record our conversations. "Tell me about Cabbagetown South again, Mom." "Oh, it was lovely," she'd say, her eyes distant. O'Malley Street had the big chestnut trees. And at the end of the block was the Grenadier Library. Not a city library. It was private, in a little stone house. A man named Mr. Abernathy ran it. He always smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper. I would search for Grenadier Library, for Abernathy, for O'Malley Street. Nothing. No census records, no property deeds, no obituaries. They were specters from a world only she remembered. At first, I thought her mind was creating a beautiful fiction. But the details were too specific, too consistent. The type of brick on the library, the sound the bakery door used to make, the name of the girl who lived next door. The subplot, the red herring that I chased for weeks, was technology. The contagion seemed to propagate digitally. The maps, the news archives, the databases, they were the first to fall. I became convinced it was a virus, a piece of rogue AI, or a state-sponsored psychological weapon delivered through the internet and broadcast signals. I bought a Faraday cage for my phone. I worked offline as much as possible. I started reading print books from second-hand shops, searching for unaltered histories. It was in one of these dusty tomes, a 1952 city almanac, that I found it. A map of Toronto. And there, tucked between Parliament and the Don River, was a small grid of streets that no longer existed on any modern map. One of them was labeled O'Malley Street. My breath caught in my chest. It was real. Her memory was real. An entire neighborhood, gone. Not just redeveloped, but erased from history so thoroughly that even I, a city planner, had never known it existed. Why? What was there that needed to be forgotten so completely? This discovery shifted my search. I started looking for patterns in the erasures. It wasn't random. Landmarks tied to specific, powerful memories seemed to be the first targets. Triumphs, tragedies, moments of intense cultural focus. The CN Tower was a symbol of ambition. Massey Hall was a temple of art. The Stanley Cup was a totem of shared passion. The contagion wasn't just deleting data, it was targeting things that created messy, complex human emotions. It was pruning the thorns from the rosebush of history. I started lurking on the deepest, most obscure corners of the internet, using encrypted browsers and public Wi-Fi. I searched for phrases from my journal, memory hole, reality bleed, the great correction. Most forums were dead ends, filled with nonsense. But then I found a string of posts on a darknet message board. They were cryptic, fragmented. User 771, the colors are fading. Did anyone else notice? Red isn't as red anymore. Anim_seeker, they took the Gardiner Expressway. Drove to work this morning, it was just, gone. The road network has rerouted. Everyone acted like it was never there. My wife thinks I'm insane. Veritas 19, beware the smilers. They are the conduits. Don't talk to them about what you see. It spreads through acknowledgement. And then, a post that made my blood run cold. It was just a single sentence accompanied by a strange, geometric symbol, a circle with 3 intersecting lines. Archivist_12, it's not a loss. It's a harvest. They are taking the anchors. When enough are gone, the shore will wash away. The post was from 2 years ago. The user account was deleted. But the symbol, that simple, chilling design, I had seen it before. It was on a lapel pin Sarah Chen had been wearing in the meeting on Tuesday. The contagion wasn't just a passive phenomenon. It had agents. The smilers. And my boss was one of them. My world, already shrinking, collapsed to the size of my apartment. I called in sick to work. I sat in the dark, the city lights painting sterile patterns on my walls. The hum of the refrigerator sounded different now, a lower, more monotonous frequency. The silence between the sounds was deeper, heavier. I visited my mother again, the almanac tucked under my arm. I opened it to the map. "Look, Mom. I found it. O'Malley Street." She peered at the page, her finger tracing the forgotten street. A tear rolled down her wrinkled cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness. It was a tear of relief. "Mr. Abernathy," she whispered. "He used to say that memory is a responsibility. A burden. He said some things are too heavy to carry forever." She looked up at me, her gaze lucid and piercing. "He said one day, someone would come to lighten the load." My fear coalesced into a single, terrifying theory. This wasn't a virus or a weapon. It was a process. A vast, planetary housekeeping service. And Mr. Abernathy, the forgotten librarian from the erased neighborhood, had known it was coming. The subplot wasn't a red herring, it was the key. The erasure of Cabbagetown South wasn't an early test. It was a precedent. They had done it before, and now they were doing it again, on a global scale. And my mother, in her fog, was the only one who remembered the groundskeeper. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. The discovery of the pin, the symbol, changed everything. The contagion wasn't a blind force of nature, it had organization. The smilers, the conduits, were not merely victims. They were participants, whether witting or not. My paranoia, which had been a diffuse fog, now had a sharp, terrifying focus, Sarah Chin. I had to know more. I went back to the office, my performance a carefully constructed mask of normalcy. I feigned recovery from a bad flu. Mark was relieved, Sarah was welcoming, her smile holding its usual placid mystery. I watched her. She moved through the office with an unnerving calm, her presence seeming to smooth out the minor frictions of the workday. Disagreements were resolved with a gentle phrase, technical problems seemed to fix themselves when she was near, and always, she wore that pin, the circle with 3 intersecting lines. I became an amateur spy. I stayed late, pretending to catch up on work, watching her. I sifted through her public files, looking for anything related to the Great Correction. I found nothing. It was too clean. The true work, I realized, wasn't happening on city servers. My break came from a moment of carelessness on her part. She left her personal tablet on her desk when she went to a meeting. My heart pounded a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I had minutes at most. I picked it up. It was unlocked. There were the usual apps, but one I didn't recognize. Its icon was the symbol from her pin. I tapped it. It opened to what looked like a progress report. There were no words, only abstract data visualizations. A map of Toronto, glowing with a soft light. Certain areas glowed brighter than others, hubs of what the app called conceptual density. The ROM, the University of Toronto, Queen's Park. These were the next targets. Below the map was a series of metrics, semantic drift, plus 0.02%. Historical burden reduction, 7.4%. Collective anxiety index, -12%. It was a dashboard for the pruning of reality. They were measuring their progress. My blood ran cold when I saw one final metric, resistant nodes, 1, a single red dot pulsed on the map. Its location was my apartment building. I closed the app, wiped the screen clean, and put the tablet back just as Sarah returned. She glanced at her desk, then at me. For a fleeting second, her placid smile faltered, replaced by a look of sharp, clinical assessment. She knew. Or she suspected. The air between us crackled with unspoken tension. I was no longer just an anomaly, I was a resistant node. I was a problem to be solved. The city began to change more rapidly. It wasn't just memories now, it was the physical world itself. One morning, the ornate gargoyles on Old City Hall were gone, the stone smooth as if they'd never been carved. When I pointed it out to a security guard, he just said, "It's a cleaner look, isn't it?" The endless, vibrant chaos of street art in Graffiti Alley began to fade, the colors muting day by day until the walls were a uniform, institutional gray. The change was insidious. There was no demolition, no sandblasting. The world was simply simplifying. My search for allies had been a disaster. The darknet forums were a dead end. Mark was lost to me. I was completely alone. And then I met Alara. I found her at the city archives, a place that was quickly becoming my church. She was a research librarian, thin and intense, with eyes that seemed to be constantly scanning for something out of place. I was looking through old municipal records, searching for more mentions of Cabbagetown South, when she approached me. "You're looking for ghosts," she said, her voice a low conspiratorial whisper. I froze. "I'm just doing some research." "No, you're not," she said, pulling up a chair. "You're looking for things that aren't there anymore. I see you. You come in here and you pull files that contradict the digital catalog. You trace the lines on old maps like you're trying to resurrect them." She leaned closer. "They took the Battle of York. Wiped it clean. Called it, the 1812 disagreement. Relief washed over me, so potent it almost brought me to my knees. I wasn't alone. The great correction, I breathed." She nodded, her expression grim. "The great lobotomy." For the next week, Alara was my lifeline. We met in secret, in the quietest corners of the archives, surrounded by the paper ghosts of the world that was. She had been noticing the changes for almost a year. Her trigger had been the disappearance of a specific species of maple tree from the botanical gardens, a tree she had written her master's thesis on. One day, all records of it, and the tree itself, were gone. Together, we pieced together our theories. It was an intelligence, she believed, but not an alien one. Something terrestrial, or perhaps extradimensional, that perceived humanity's chaotic, conflict-ridden history as a sickness. Its goal was peace, simplicity, serenity. A world without sharp edges, without painful memories or inconvenient truths. A world smoothed into a featureless sphere. Our investigation led us back to my mother's memory. Cabbagetown South. The first major erasure we could prove. If we can find physical proof, Alara argued, something the contagion can't digitally alter or subtly fade, then we have a weapon. We have an anchor. Armed with the 1952 almanac and my mother's fragmented descriptions, we went to the place where it should have been. It was now a sterile parquet and a series of identical townhouses with bland, beige siding. It was a place designed to be forgotten. We spent hours searching, using my mother's memory of the Grenadier Library as our ground zero. It was by a big oak, she had said. We found the oldest oak tree in the park. We started digging at its base with a small garden trowel, feeling like mad archaeologists. And then, we found it. 6 inches down, my trowel hit something hard. Not a rock. It was square. We scraped away the dirt and uncovered a single, slate-gray paving stone, etched with a pattern of a bird in flight. It was completely unlike the modern interlocking brick around it. "This is it," Alara whispered, her eyes wide. "This is proof. We had done it. We had found a physical anchor, a piece of the lost world." I felt a surge of triumph. We could show this to people. We could. I looked up at Alara. The triumphant gleam in her eyes was fading, replaced by a strange, milky calm. She was staring at the stone, but her focus seemed to be turning inward. "Alara?" I asked, my voice tight with dread. She blinked slowly, like someone waking from a long dream. She looked at the paving stone, then at me. And then, she smiled. It was the smile. Placid. Empty. Serene. You know, Daniel, she said, her voice soft and melodic, the intensity gone. This is interesting, but it's from a long time ago. She stood up, brushing the dirt from her knees. It's probably not something we need to think about. The words hit me like a physical blow. The act of finding the proof, of directly confronting the erasure, had triggered her conversion. The contagion wasn't just erasing the past, it was actively defending itself against rediscovery. By showing her the truth, I had pushed her into the arms of the lie. She turned and walked away, not looking back, her posture already calmer, more placid. I was left kneeling in the dirt, clutching a stone from a world no one else remembered, more alone than I had ever been in my life. The red dot on Sarah Chen's secret map pulsed in my mind. I wasn't just a resistant node anymore. I was a threat. And the system was correcting the error. Phase 4, Confrontation/Revelation and Aftermath. The loss of Alara was the final break. I understood then. There was no fighting this. The contagion wasn't an enemy to be defeated, it was the new operating system of reality, and I was a piece of corrupted, legacy code. To try and prove the truth to others was to act as a vector, forcing their minds to confront a contradiction so profound that the only escape was assimilation. I was the problem. My memory was the disease. I stopped going to work. I didn't quit, I just vanished from their world as surely as the CN Tower had vanished from theirs. I imagined Sarah Chen looking at the red dot on her tablet one morning and finding it gone, the error corrected. Let her think I had succumbed. It was safer that way. My world shrank to 2 locations, my sterile apartment box and the warm, chaotic room of my mother's long-term care home. The city outside my window became a foreign country. I watched as the streetlights, once a simple sodium orange, began to flicker in complex, rhythmic patterns at night, a silent, coded language I couldn't comprehend. The sharp angles of the newer buildings seemed to soften when I wasn't looking directly at them, their geometry subtly giving way to a more organic, rounded aesthetic. The world was being sanded down, its edges beveled for safety. The confrontation I had been expecting was not with Sarah or some shadowy cabal. It was with myself. I could let go. I could accept the quiet, the simplicity. I could look out the window and see the unnamed spire as just a broadcast tower, forget the name Gooderham and Wirtz, and let the Battle of York fade into a minor disagreement. It would be so much easier. The constant, grinding friction of my memory against the smooth wall of the new reality was exhausting. Peace was on offer, a serene emptiness, and all I had to do was stop thinking about it. I went to see my mother. She was having a lucid day, her mind a clear pool. I didn't bring the old maps or my journal. I just sat with her. "Tell me about the bakery, Mom," I said. "The one with the blue awning." And she did. She told me about the smell of baking bread mingling with the exhaust of the old Red Rocket streetcars. She described the bell that jingled when the door opened. She remembered the flower on the baker's apron and the exact shade of blue on the awning, faded by the summer sun. And I listened. I didn't try to find it on a map. I didn't search for a photograph. I just listened. I let her memory become my memory. Her world became my sanctuary. The great correction had failed with her because it couldn't erase what was already perceived as broken. And it was failing with me, because I was now choosing to live in her brokenness. I was abandoning the official, sanctioned reality and taking up residence in the archive of her mind. "It's better now, isn't it?" she said one afternoon, looking out her window at the placid, simplified city. "It's so much quieter. All the noise, all the remembering, it's a heavy thing to carry, Danny. All those wars and arguments and sad stories. All the clutter. We don't need it. It's good that someone is finally tidying up." There it was. The revelation. Not a cosmic horror, not a malevolent intelligence, but a janitor. A universal housekeeper sweeping away the messy, painful, glorious clutter of history because it was deemed too burdensome. It wasn't a punishment, it was a kindness. A lobotomy performed as an act of love. The sheer, terrifying banality of it was worse than any monster. This was the universe deciding we couldn't be trusted with our own past, and taking it away for our own good. My final choice was made. I would not succumb. But I would not fight. I would become an archivist of the lost. A curator of one. I spend my days with my mother. She is my last link, my Rosetta Stone. I write everything down in my journal, the book of what was. I write about the CN Tower, about Massey Hall, about the gargoyles of Old City Hall. I write down her memories of O'Malley Street and Mr. Abernathy's library. I am building a museum that will never have a visitor. Sometimes, when the light is just right, I can still see it from her window. The tower. It's fainter now, a shimmering outline against the sky, a ghost of concrete and ambition. No one else sees it. The people on the street below move in calm, predictable patterns, their faces untroubled, their minds unburdened. They are happy. They are free. I am the last man in a city of ghosts, haunted not by the dead, but by the living. I am the keeper of the clutter, the curator of the noise. I have lost the world, but I have not lost my mind. Or, perhaps, I have lost the world in order to keep my mind. I am not sure there is a difference anymore. I open my journal. The pen feels heavy in my hand. I look at the shimmering outline in the sky, and I begin to write, describing its shape, its height, its purpose, for a future that will have no concept of what it means to build something that touches the clouds, just to see if you can. Phase 1, the unsettling mundane. The stroke had stolen the right angles from my world. That's how I explained it to myself in the quiet, dust-moted hours of my new life. A cerebral hemorrhage, a bloom of darkness in the parietal lobe. Dr. Sharma had used clinical terms, impaired spatial cognition, visual agnosia, but to me, an architect for 45 years, it was simpler. The world had lost its plumb line. My retirement, forced upon me by a traitorous blood vessel, was a quiet affair in a quiet suburb of Melbourne. I lived on a street of tidy brick veneers and manicured nature strips, a world built on the comforting certainty of 90-degree angles. A world I could no longer trust. The first time it happened, truly happened, I was in my own living room. The corner where the bookshelf met the wall seemed soft. Not physically, of course. The plaster was hard and cool beneath my trembling fingertips. But visually, it was wrong. It felt obtuse, maybe 91 degrees. An architectural sin. I fetched my laser measure, the one I'd kept from my practice. The red dot split perfectly. The readout was unequivocal, 90.0 degrees. My brain, however, screamed liar. I started a new sketchbook. My old ones were filled with triumphs, cantilevered balconies soaring over the Yarra, glass-fronted monoliths that scraped the Melbourne sky. This new one was for therapy. I would draw my house, my street, my world, not as I saw it, but as I knew it should be. I would use my T-square and my 4H pencils to impose order on my fractured perception. It was a way to retrain my eye, to convince the broken part of my brain that a right angle was, and always would be, a right angle. My days fell into a routine. Wake, feel the slight lag between thought and movement in my left hand, make tea, and then sit at my drafting table in the sunroom, sketching. I drew the jacaranda in my front yard, its branches a chaotic but mathematically sound fractal. I drew the precise, uniform pickets of my fence. And I drew my neighbor's house. Mr. Henderson lived next door. A placid, retired accountant with a passion for his lawn. His house was a mirror of my own, a study in suburban symmetry. One afternoon, sketching his garage, I felt a peculiar artistic whim. The wide, roll-up door felt exposed. An interruption in the solid brick facade. On a clean sheet of moleskine paper, I redrew it. I rendered a solid wall of mission brown brick where the door should be, complete with a small, high window for balance. It looked better. More secure. I felt a sense of satisfaction, the old professional pride, and thought nothing more of it. A week later, I heard the sound of trod eyes. Bricklayers. They were at Henderson's house, erecting scaffolding in front of his garage. I watched, my tea growing cold in my hands, as they laid a course of new bricks, identical to the ones I had drawn, across the opening. I had to talk to him. I found Henderson weeding his petunias, his movements slow and methodical. "Morning, David," I said, leaning on our shared fence. "Bit of a change, is it?" He looked up, his eyes unfocused for a moment, as if I'd woken him from a dream. "Isaac." "Yes. Just felt it was time. Bricking up the garage. Where will you put the car?" He shrugged, a slow, rolling motion. "Don't drive so much anymore. It's better this way. Quieter." His placidity was unnerving. There was no frustration, no talk of council permits or cost. Just a serene acceptance. It was better this way. I retreated to my house, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. A coincidence. A bizarre, unnerving coincidence. That's all it could be. My stroke was making me paranoid, making me see patterns where there were none. But the world kept tilting. The footpath on my morning walk to the milk bar felt a meter longer one day. The steps up to my own front porch felt steeper, the riser height subtly increased. Each time, I'd retreat to my sketchbook and draw the world back into its correct proportions. I was a cartographer of a receding reality. I became obsessed with the Henderson house. The new brick wall was perfect, the mortar lines flawless. But it was also wrong. The light seemed to bend around it, the shadows it cast were too deep, too sharp. Our cat, a pragmatic ginger Tom named Rusty, would give it a wide berth, arching his back and hissing at the empty space where the driveway used to be. Then, about a month after the renovation, the Hendersons vanished. There was no for sale sign. No moving van. One day, the house was just empty. The bins weren't put out. The mail overflowed the letterbox. I called the police after a week. A young, bored-looking constable did a welfare check. He came back to me, chewing gum. "House is clear, mate." Neighbors on the other side said they went to Perth to see her sister. Indefinitely. "But all their things are still there," I protested. "The car's gone, but the house." "People do strange things," he said, and that was that. The Henderson house became a monument to my anxiety. I'd watch it from my sunroom, sketchbook open. It wasn't just the garage now. The roofline seemed to sag when I wasn't looking directly at it. The angle of the eaves felt acute, predatory. In my peripheral vision, the whole structure seemed to twist, to breathe. I sketched it obsessively, trying to pin it down. To force it back into its banal, suburban shape. But sometimes, my pencil would move of its own accord. I drew a crack, a thin, spidery line running from the corner of a window. 3 days later, I saw it, a dark fissure in the stucco, stark in the afternoon sun. The terror was no longer a background hum. It was a clear, ringing tone in my head. Was my brain damaged not just perceiving these changes, but somehow, causing them? Was I sketching a new reality into existence? Or was I the only one sensitive enough, broken enough, to see the world as it was truly becoming? I was a retired architect, recovering from a stroke, living in a quiet Melbourne suburb. And I was terrified I was either going insane, or that I was the only sane person left. The line between the two felt as thin and fragile as a pencil line on paper. Phase 2, growing awareness and isolation. The sketchbook became my enemy and my only tool. It was a logbook of creeping insanity, a grimoire of architectural horror. The power, or the curse, was undeniable now. It was no longer about coincidences. It was about cause and effect. I had to test it. I had to know. The fear of being the cause was eclipsed by the greater fear of the unknown. I chose something small, something nobody but me would ever notice. At the end of our cul-de-sac stood a single, tired-looking street lamp. Its concrete pole was pocked and stained, but its form was fundamentally sound. In my sketchbook, I drew it again and again. For a week, I drew it perfectly. Then, on a Tuesday, with a trembling hand, I added a detail. I gave the pole a slight, almost imperceptible curve, a gentle bow towards the east, as if it were wilting under the weight of the morning sun. For 2 days, nothing. I walked past it, heart hammering, and it remained stubbornly, reassuringly straight. The relief was so profound it made me dizzy. It was all in my head. The Henderson incident was a fluke. The crack was a coincidence. On the third day, I saw it. The curve. It was exactly as I had drawn it. Faint, subtle, but undeniably there. A concrete pole, bowing to a whim I'd had in my sunroom. I leaned against a fence, gasping for air. It wasn't a prediction. It was a command. My drawings were instructions, whispered to the fabric of the world. My world shrank to the size of my property line. The walks to the milk bar stopped. I had groceries delivered. The thought of accidentally redesigning a public space was paralyzing. What if I idly sketched a bridge with a missing support? What if a doodle of a cracked pavement became a reality under the wheels of a school bus? The sketchbook stayed on my drafting table, a loaded weapon I was terrified to touch. My isolation became a physical presence, a guest in my quiet house. I spoke to no one but the checkout girl on the phone. My old colleagues, I imagined, had written me off after the stroke. They'd sent a fruit basket and a card signed with 24 variations of, "Get well soon, mate." I hadn't heard from them since. My world was my garden, my cat, and the creeping wrongness of the house next door. Then, the phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, but the ringtone, a standard, jarring bring, felt like an intrusion from a world I no longer belonged to. "Dad?" The voice was hesitant, laced with the familiar cadence of duty. "Chloe." "Chloe," I said, my own voice rusty. "What's wrong?" It was always our opening gambit. "Nothing's wrong. Can't I just call my father?" The defensiveness was pure Chloe. She was a physicist, a grad student at ANU. Her world was one of elegant equations and quantum uncertainties, a universe far grander and more complex than my brick-and-mortar reality. Our relationship was a thing of awkward angles and stress junctures, a structure I had failed to build correctly from the start. I had been an architect of buildings, not families. "I'm coming down to Melbourne," she said, the words rushed. "There's a particle physics conference at Monash. I was wondering, if it's not too much trouble, if I could stay for a few days." A wave of hope and fear washed over me. Hope for a connection, for a tether to the normal world. Fear that she would see the cracks. Not just in the walls, but in me. "Of course," I said. "The spare room is ready." She arrived on a Thursday, pulling up in a rental car that seemed too new for our quiet street. She was all sharp edges and nervous energy, her eyes darting around, cataloging, analyzing. She hugged me stiffly, the way one handles a fragile, antique piece of furniture. "The place looks good, Dad," she said, her gaze sweeping over the living room. "You're keeping well." I watched her, my breath held. I waited for her to notice the corner, the one that screamed at me every day. Nothing. I saw her glance out the window at the Henderson house. "Neighbors get a new wall?" she asked, her tone casual. "Something like that," I mumbled. For 2 days, she was a ghost of normalcy in my haunted house. She saw nothing. The warped street lamp, the unnaturally long footpath, the predatory angle of Henderson's roof, to her, they were just a street lamp, a path, a roof. My carefully constructed world of dread was invisible to her. The relief was crushing. It proved it, the anomaly was me. My brain was broken in a very specific, very strange way. I was a man haunted by architectural phantoms of his own making. The world wasn't changing, I was. It was a terrible diagnosis, but it was a diagnosis. It was something I could name. On the third day, she was looking for a book on string theory she'd sworn she packed. Her search led her to my study, to the drafting table in the sunroom. And to the sketchbook. "You're drawing again," she said, her voice softer than I'd heard it in years. "That's good." She reached for it. "Don't," I said, the word sharper than I intended. She froze, her hand hovering over the black moleskine cover. She looked at me, her physicist's eyes suddenly analytical again. The scientist had replaced the daughter. Why not? I had no answer. I couldn't articulate the terror bound in its pages. Slowly, defiantly, she picked it up. She opened it. She flicked through the pages in silence. The drawings of the house. The precise, desperate lines. Then she got to the Henderson section. She saw the first drawing, the garage door intact. Then the next, the brick wall rendered in painstaking detail, with my spidery note in the margin, aesthetic correction. Felt necessary. May 10th. Then she saw the photo I'd printed and pasted next to it, taken from my window, of the real bricklayers at work. Date, May 17th. She kept turning. She saw the drawing of the crack in the stucco. My note, idle thought. A stress fracture. June 4th. Next to it, another photo. The real crack. Date, June 7th. Then she saw the street lamp. The before sketch, perfectly straight. The after sketch, curved. Note, test. A willful act. June 12th. She looked up from the book, her face pale. Not with fear, but with a terrifying, clinical curiosity. "What is this, Dad?" "My therapy," I whispered. "My brain, it sees things. It sees things before they happen," she pressed, her voice low. "Or does it make them happen?" I had no answer. I just shook my head, a profound weariness settling deep into my bones. She closed the book gently and placed it back on the table. She looked out the window, at the street, at the houses, as if seeing them for the first time. The rest of the day passed in a thick, unspoken tension. The next morning, I came downstairs to find her standing in the kitchen, staring at the corner where the pantry met the wall. She was motionless, her coffee untouched on the counter. "Chloe." She didn't turn. "It's not 90 degrees, she said, her voice a dead flat whisper. "That corner. It's wrong." I looked. It was the same corner I'd agonized over for months. A corner she had walked past a dozen times without a second glance. She finally turned to face me, her eyes wide with a horror that mirrored my own. "I didn't see it before," she said. "I didn't see any of it until I looked at your drawings." The blood drained from my face. The contagion wasn't in the water, or the air, or in my broken mind alone. It was in the sketchbook. It was information. And I had just infected my own daughter. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. The house became a laboratory. The strained silence between father and daughter was replaced by a frantic, whispered collaboration. Chloe, the theoretical physicist, and I, the broken architect, were now partners in a terrifying new science. The initial horror gave way to a feverish need to understand. "It's not magic, Dad," she insisted, pacing the living room while I sat, sketchbook open on my lap like a sacred text. "There's a principle at work. The universe is probabilistic at the quantum level. A particle's state isn't fixed until it's observed. We call it the observer effect. This isn't a particle, Chloe. It's a 50-kilo concrete pole. But what if the principle scales up?" she countered, her eyes alight with a terrifying intellectual fire. "What if what we call consensus reality is just a macroscale wave function? A shared assumption. Everyone agrees a street lamp is straight, so it stays straight. The probability collapses into a single, stable state. She gestured at me, at my head. Your stroke, it didn't break your perception. It knocked you out of the consensus. You stopped agreeing with everyone else. You became an independent observer with the power to collapse the wave function differently. And the sketchbook? I asked, my voice hoarse. The sketchbook, she said, tapping the cover, isn't a predictor. It's a focusing tool. It's a way to articulate a new observation with enough precision to make it manifest. You're not drawing what will be, you're defining what is. And when I looked at it, I learned the language. You taught me how to see the other probabilities. Her theory was both elegant and horrifying. It turned my quiet suburban street into a battlefield of perception. We started small, controlled experiments. We chose a single, faded terracotta roof tile on a house 3 doors down. I drew it in the book, rendering it a vibrant, glossy blue. Chloe watched over my shoulder, her breath misting the page. For 2 days, we checked every few hours, using my old binoculars. On the 3rd morning, there it was. A single spot of brilliant cerulean in a sea of faded orange. A tiny, defiant shout against the consensus. The discovery of our shared power was not empowering. It was suffocating. We were 2 people who could bend the world to our will, but we were adrift in an ocean of 7 billion others whose shared belief kept reality from dissolving into chaos. Chloe, driven by her scientific curiosity, started digging. She spent hours on her laptop, pulling up council records, historical surveys, geological maps. There has to be a reason it started here, she muttered, scrolling through digitized archives. A vulnerability. Meanwhile, the world outside my window continued its quiet unraveling. The changes were no longer confined to my accidental sketches. Something else was at work. I began to notice the neighbors. Not just their houses, but their movements. Mrs. Gable from number 12, who used to garden with chaotic enthusiasm, now weeded her lawn in perfect, straight lines, moving with the rigid precision of a plodding machine. The teenagers who used to loiter on the corner now stood in a silent, triangular formation for hours after school, before dispersing as if a bell had rung. They weren't hostile. They weren't zombies. They were just, realigned. They were adopting a new, alien geometry in their daily lives. One evening at dusk, I saw a dozen people from up and down the street emerge from their homes and stand on their nature strips. They were all silent, all facing the same direction, not north, not south, but towards the blank, light-absorbing wall of the Henderson house. They stood for 10 minutes, a silent congregation worshipping an architectural void, before turning in unison and returning to their homes. I found something, Chloe said, calling me over to her laptop. She had an old survey map of the suburb from the 1950s on the screen. Our street was marked, the plots laid out. And right in the middle of the plot for number 7, the Hendersons' property, was a small, red triangle with a note. TP42, DECOM. Triangulation point. Surveyor's correction REQ. A triangulation point, I breathed. A fundamental survey marker. It's one of the original points they used to map this whole area, Chloe explained. The anchor point they used to define the geometry of the landscape. They decommissioned it when they built the houses, said it was unstable. Dad, what if it's a weak point? A place where the consensus is thin. Where reality is, suggestible. The Henderson house wasn't a cause, it was a symptom. It was ground zero. The place where the contagion of this new reality had first leaked through. And my drawing, my foolish, arrogant sketch of the garage, had been like throwing a match on a gas leak. I hadn't started the fire, but I had given it form. The escalation was no longer just about us. We weren't the only architects. Something else, or someone else, was sketching, too, on a much grander scale. This other architect wasn't using a pencil, it was using people. Their routines, their new obsessions, their silent gatherings, they were becoming part of a new design. Their lives were the lines, their houses the nodes, in a vast, incomprehensible blueprint being laid over our world. The true horror of our situation dawned on me. We hadn't discovered a superpower. We had found the drafting tools lying around an alien, construction site. And the foreman was still on the job. One afternoon, I tried to fight back. I took the sketchbook and drew the Henderson house as it was originally. I drew the garage door back in, the roofline straight, the windows benign. I poured all my will, all my memory of how it should be, into the drawing. I felt a strain behind my eyes, a psychic tearing. For a moment, looking out the window, I thought I saw the brick wall flicker, turning translucent, the shadow of a roll-up door shimmering behind it. Then, a wave of nausea hit me so hard I had to grip the table. The houses across the street seemed to stretch and compress. The jacaranda's branches twisted into impossible, Escher-like knots. The silent, geometric order of the street fought back against my nostalgic intrusion. The pressure was immense, a physical force pushing against my perception. The new reality wasn't a fragile layer on top of the old one. It was the new foundation. And it was setting like concrete. I dropped the pencil. The vision snapped back. The Henderson house was as it was, solid, immutable. But now, standing on the lawn, was Mrs. Henderson. She was back. She was holding a leash, and at the end of it was a dog I'd never seen before. The dog was walking, but not in a normal way. It was moving in a series of perfect, 90-degree turns. A square. It completed one square, paused, and began another. Mrs. Henderson watched it, a small, placid smile on her face. The same vacant, serene expression her husband had worn when he told me bricking up the garage was better this way. She wasn't a prisoner. She hadn't been to Perth. She had simply stepped into the new design. And she was content. Phase 4, Confrontation and Aftermath. The confrontation, when it came, wasn't a battle. It was a surrender. There was no monster to fight, no villain to unmask. There was only the quiet, inexorable pressure of a world remaking itself, and the horrifying realization that we were not its masters. We were standing in the sunroom, the sketchbook lying open between us. Outside, the geometry of the street was hardening. The silent gatherings were more frequent. The behavioral loops were more complex. People moved with a shared, unspoken purpose, their paths weaving intricate, invisible patterns on the pavement. The world was becoming a diagram, and its inhabitants were the ink. "We have to do something," I said, the words feeling hollow even as I spoke them. "We can't just let it happen." My hand hovered over the sketchbook. The architect in me, the builder, the man who imposed order on chaos, screamed for action. I can overwrite it. I can draw something it can't incorporate. A disruption. A void in the street. A house that's inside out. I imagine sketching a true impossibility, a line of pure chaos that might shatter the encroaching, rigid order. "No, Dad." Chloe's voice was firm, pulling me back from the brink. She had been staring out the window, not with my terror, but with a physicist's awe. She had papers scattered around her, covered in equations I couldn't begin to comprehend. "You can't. I've been running the numbers. This isn't an invasion. It's a phase transition." "A what?" "Like water turning to ice," she explained, her voice low and steady. "It's still H2O, but its fundamental structure, its properties, have changed. We were living in a liquid state, fluid, chaotic, based on a messy human consensus. This is the crystalline phase. Rigid. Ordered. Mathematical. It's not destroying reality. It's stabilizing it into a new form." Her words hit me harder than any physical blow. The contagion wasn't a disease. It was a cure. A cure for the chaotic, unpredictable nature of human consciousness. The other architect wasn't a malevolent entity, it was a universal constant, a law of nature reasserting itself. The unstable triangulation point under Henderson's house was simply where the crystallization had begun. "We aren't the architects, Dad," she said, her eyes meeting mine. The fear was gone, replaced by a profound, terrifying understanding. "We're just the first ones who found the drafting tools." The choice became starkly clear. We could fight it, trying to draw our messy, chaotic, human world back into existence. It would be a losing battle, a struggle against the universe itself that would inevitably shatter our minds. We could flee, but where to? This wasn't a localized event. Our suburb was just ahead of the curve. The phase transition would be global. Or we could adapt. I looked outside. Mrs. Gable was trimming her hedge, but her shears moved in perfect, rhythmic arcs, carving a flawless sine wave into the greenery. Mr. Henderson was sweeping his porch, his broom strokes defining a series of immaculate, concentric circles. They were not suffering. They were at peace, their anxieties erased, their lives given a new, clear, and simple purpose. They were components in a grand, functioning machine. My entire life had been about creating functional, ordered spaces for chaotic human lives. I built structures to contain the messiness of being. Now, the world itself was becoming the structure. I looked at Chloe. She was watching the neighbors with a look of detached, academic fascination. The horror was fading, replaced by the irresistible pull of a new, profound physics unfolding before her eyes. She was a scientist, and this was the greatest experiment in history. I looked down at the Moleskine sketchbook. My tool of therapy, my weapon, my curse. All this time, I had been using it to fight the change, to cling to the memory of a world that was already gone. I had been trying to draw the past. Slowly, I picked up my 4H pencil. The graphite felt cool and familiar in my fingers. My hand, the one that had been clumsy since the stroke, felt steady. I turned to a fresh page. I looked at the plan of my own house, the one I knew by heart. The living room corner that had tormented me. The hallway that felt too long. The stairs that seemed to shift. They were flaws in the old design, incompatible with the new order. With a deep, shuddering breath, I began to draw. I wasn't drawing a memory. I wasn't fighting. I was designing. I straightened the corner of the living room, not to a perfect 90 degrees, but to a clean, stable 120, creating a new, harmonious hexagonal space. I shortened the hallway, aligning it with a newly perceived axis that ran through the house. I redesigned the stairs into a gentle, elegant spiral that followed a perfect golden ratio. I wasn't trying to reclaim the past. I was building a shelter for the future. Chloe came to stand behind me, her hand resting on my shoulder. She looked from my drawing to the world outside, and back again. She understood. We are still here, in our quiet house on the quiet street in Melbourne. The world outside continues its crystallization. The silent, geometric ballets of our neighbors are the new normal. The sky sometimes has edges. The hum of the universe has a new, clear pitch. It is a world of terrifying, beautiful, inhuman order. But in here, we have our sanctuary. Chloe works on her equations, mapping the new laws of our reality. And I draw. I am an architect again. I am not building for humanity anymore. I am building for what comes next. My daughter and I, we are the caretakers of our own small corner, designing our survival, one perfect, impossible angle at a time, in a world that has finally, irrevocably, found its new plumb static people. Phase 1, the unsettling mundane. The rain was the only thing that felt real anymore. It was a constant, a percussive soundtrack to my life played out on the double-paned glass of my 14th floor apartment. Here, in my hermetically sealed box in the Seattle sky, the world came to me through glass and glowing screens. I was Eliza Corrin, 29, a Tier 2 remote IT support technician for a soulless data management firm. My job was to solve problems for people I'd never meet, their faces pixelated squares on my main monitor, their anxieties reduced to ticket numbers. My own anxiety had a name, agoraphobia. It had crept up on me slowly, a quiet contagion of its own, until the thought of the apartment building's lobby felt like staring into an abyss. My world had shrunk to these 600 square feet, a fortress of ergonomic chairs, humming servers, and smart devices that catered to my every whim. It was a comfortable, curated isolation. I had my sister, Maya, on video calls, my groceries delivered, my work piped in through a fiber optic cable. I was safe. The first crack in that safety was imperceptible to anyone but me. It came during a call with a Mr. Henderson from accounting, a man with a comb-over and the weary eyes of someone who'd seen too many spreadsheets. He was having trouble with a shared drive. Standard stuff. But as I walked him through the steps, I noticed his background. It was a tastefully blurred home office, a potted fern on a bookshelf behind him. The fern's frond, caught in a permanent, gentle curve, was utterly motionless. No subtle sway from the building's ventilation, no tremor. Just, still. I told myself it was a virtual background. A high-quality one, but still fake. Then I noticed his blink rate. In the 10 minutes it took to resolve his issue, I saw his eyelids close exactly once. A slow, deliberate motion, then nothing for minutes on end. His head made minuscule adjustments, his mouth moved, but his eyes were fixed, unnervingly wide. "All right, Mr. Henderson, that should do it," I said, my voice a little tight. "Thank you, Eliza." "Excellent service," he replied, his voice perfectly normal. He smiled, a stretched, static expression, and ended the call. His image vanished, replaced by my own reflection in the dark screen, pale, big-eyed, framed by the blue light of my other monitors. I shook it off. Stress. Too much screen time. The curse of a job where you stare at faces all day is that you start to see patterns that aren't there. But the patterns kept coming. My building had a state-of-the-art security system, and one of its perks, or so the brochure claimed, was access to a network of public-facing cameras. The lobby, the mailroom, the street corner outside. I used them to gauge the world, to know when the delivery guy was approaching or when the lobby was empty enough for a hypothetical dash to the trash chute. That afternoon, I watched Marcus, the day shift doorman, a big, friendly man who always had a kind word for my sister when she visited. He was standing at his post, hands clasped behind his back, looking out the glass doors. Perfectly normal. I minimized the window and went back to work. An hour later, I checked again. Marcus was in the exact same position. Not similar. Exact. The crease on his left trouser leg was an identical jagged line. The reflection of the lobby lights on his bald head hadn't shifted a millimeter. A tenant walked past him, swiping their key fob. Marcus didn't turn, didn't nod. He was a statue. My heart began a low, anxious thrum. I opened a stopwatch app on my phone and left the camera feed open in the corner of my monitor. 10 minutes passed. 20. 45. He didn't move. Not a twitch, not a weight shift. He was as still as Mr. Henderson's fern. Then, at the 45-minute and 17-second mark, he blinked, turned his head smoothly, and greeted another tenant by name. Reality snapped back into place. I felt a wave of dizziness. Maybe he was just incredibly disciplined. A former Queen's Guard or something. The thought was absurd, a desperate scramble for a rational explanation that felt flimsy even to me. That night, the real fear began. I was woken not by a sound, but by a light. My 65-inch smart TV, which I hadn't used in weeks, was on. The screen was glowing, but it was silent. It was displaying a live feed from a traffic camera somewhere downtown, overlooking a crosswalk. The timestamp in the corner confirmed it was current, 3:17 a.m. Under the sickly orange glow of a streetlight, a woman in a bright red coat stood at the curb. The walk sign was lit. She lifted her right foot to step into the street, her body leaning forward, and then, she was back on the curb, foot flat on the pavement. She lifted it again. Back on the curb. A perfect, 2-second loop. Step, reset. Step, reset. She was a corrupted animation, a broken GIF embedded in the heart of my city. Beside her, a man holding an umbrella stared straight ahead, unmoving. He didn't blink. None of the few people visible in the background did. They were all part of the scene, static elements around the glitching woman. I fumbled for the remote, my hand shaking, and turned it off. The screen went black, but the image was seared into my brain. I didn't just turn off the TV, I got up and yanked its plug from the wall with such force the plastic scraped against the socket. I stood in the dark, my breath catching in my throat, listening to the hum of my servers and the ceaseless, drumming rain. The sounds I had always found comforting now felt like the low-level noise of a system that was fundamentally, terrifyingly, breaking down. The next day, I had my weekly video call with Maya. She was my anchor, my one unfiltered connection to the outside. She lived across town, working as a graphic designer. Her face filled the screen, vibrant and real. "You look tired, Eli," she said, concern crinkling the corners of her eyes. "Not sleeping?" "Just a weird night," I hedged. I couldn't tell her. She'd say I was spiraling, that my phobia was creating phantom fears. She'd be rational. And how do you argue with rationality when your evidence is a doorman who doesn't move and a TV that plays nightmares? We talked about her work, about a new restaurant she'd tried. It was normal. It was grounding. Then, just as she was laughing at a joke I'd made, her image froze. Her mouth was open, her eyes wide with mirth. The audio cut out. A little spinning wheel appeared in the center of the screen. Reconnecting. It happened all the time. Bad Wi-Fi, network congestion. But this time, it felt different. It felt deliberate. After 3 long seconds, her face unfroze, but her expression had changed. The laugh was gone. She was mid-sentence, talking about something else entirely. So the client hated the font, of course. Can you believe it? She hadn't noticed the interruption. The conversation had forked. I was on one timeline, she was on another, and the software had just clumsily spliced them back together. "Maya," I said slowly, "did your connection just drop?" She frowned, a perfect, fluid motion. "No. I don't think so." "Why?" You froze for a second." "Oh, probably just your end. This building of yours has terrible bandwidth, I swear." She dismissed it with a wave. A placid, easy dismissal. And in that moment, I felt a chasm open between us. It wasn't just my apartment that was isolated. It was me. I was the only one who could see the seams. I spent the rest of the day in a state of hypervigilance. I saw it everywhere. On a news report, a politician at a podium paused for a breath that lasted 5 seconds too long, while the reporters in front of him remained stock-still. On a live feed of Pike Place Market, a fishmonger's arm, mid-throw, jittered back and forth like a buffering video. The world was skipping. Stuttering, freezing. And the people inside it, the static people, seemed utterly unaware. Or worse, they were part of the glitch. I opened a new file on my secure drive, password protected it, and named it the log. I typed in the first entry, October 26th. It's starting. Or I am. Underscore 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 underscore. Phase 2, Growing Awareness and Isolation. The log became my religion. Every stutter, every freeze, every unnaturally still person was documented with obsessive detail. November 2nd, 11:43 a.m., delivery driver, name unknown. Stood motionless on doorstep for 92 seconds. Did not react to cat running past. Resumed motion to press doorbell. November 5, 8:12 p.m., neighbor in 14B, visible across the courtyard. Watched him stand in his kitchen, holding a mug, for 17 minutes. His wife walked around him twice. Did not acknowledge him. My work suffered. During calls, I was no longer listening to the client's problems, I was scrutinizing their backgrounds, counting their blinks, watching for the telltale freeze frame that signaled the contagion. My ticket resolution times plummeted. I got a gentle warning email from my supervisor about performance metrics. My search history became a catalog of paranoia. Mass psychogenic illness, shared neurological disorder, time perception anomalies, glitches in reality. The results were always mundane: articles about epilepsy, psychological case studies, philosophical thought experiments. Nothing matched the silent, passive, widespread nature of what I was witnessing. The world wasn't ending in fire and screams, but in silent, frozen moments that no one else seemed to register. It was during a late-night deep dive, trawling the forgotten corners of the internet with obscure search strings like "people pausing like video" and "reality buffering," that I finally found it. A link, buried in a defunct conspiracy forum from 5 years ago. It led to a message board, stark and primitive, with a black background and green text. It looked like something from the dial-up era. Its name was The Missing Frame. My heart hammered against my ribs. I was no longer alone. The forum was a ghost town, mostly, with threads dating back years. But there were recent posts. People from London, Tokyo, Buenos Aires, all describing the same things I was seeing. They used their own terminology: the stillness, pausers, lag. They shared short, grainy clips from security cameras or phone recordings. A businessman in Frankfurt walking into a wall, resetting a step, and continuing on as if nothing had happened. A child on a swing in a park in Ohio, swinging to the apex and then just staying there for a full minute against the laws of physics. It was vindication. It was terror. This wasn't in my head. It was global. A user named Cassandra_complex was the forum's unacknowledged leader. Her posts were lucid, analytical, and deeply paranoid. She theorized that the phenomenon was growing, that the lags were getting longer and more frequent. She warned against trying to film it too openly. "Don't draw attention," she wrote. "Observation has a cost." Another user, Glitch Hunter 88, was her opposite. He was prolific, almost manic, posting high-definition clips he'd captured. He had a whole thread dedicated to what he called sync events, moments where entire crowds would freeze simultaneously. He was gathering evidence, trying to build a case to take to, well, he never said who. Cassandra_complex warned him directly. "You're being too loud. They'll notice." Who's they? The men in black. The simulation overlords? Glitch Hunter 88 scoffed. "We have to show this to people." 2 days later, Glitch Hunter 88's account was gone. His profile was a dead link. Every post he had ever made now read, "User deleted." A cold dread, colder than the Seattle rain, washed over me. It was one thing to see a stranger freeze on a camera feed. It was another to see someone who knew what you knew simply erased. I tried to talk to Maya again. I needed a tether, a sanity check. I decided to try a different approach, not mentioning the freezing, but something adjacent. "Hey, did you see that weird clip online?" I asked during our next call. "The one with the flock of pigeons in Japan that all took off and landed in a perfect loop?" Maya squinted. "Pigeons? No. Eli, are you on those weird forums again? You know that stuff just feeds your anxiety." "It's not anxiety, Maya, it's real. I'm seeing things." "Of course you're seeing things," she said, her voice softening with practiced patience, the voice one uses for a frightened child. You're cooped up in that apartment 24/7. Your brain is bored. It's making things up to entertain itself. Dr. Evans said this could happen. The mention of my therapist was a low blow. It was a dismissal of everything I was experiencing, packaging it neatly as a symptom of my known condition. Her face was so earnest, so concerned. But as she spoke, I watched the reflection of her lamp on the picture frame behind her. The light was steady, unwavering. There were no natural microfluctuations. It was a static asset in the background of her scene. The conversation felt scripted, her response a pre-programmed dialogue tree for, subject, Eliza_anxiety_spiral. You're right, I said, the words tasting like ash. I'm just tired. It was easier to fold, to retreat. Arguing was like shouting at a brick wall that, every few minutes, would subtly change color. The isolation was now absolute. The one person I trusted was on the other side of a divide I couldn't explain. The missing frame was a comfort, but a dangerous one. I was a lurker, a ghost, terrified of becoming a user deleted myself. My agoraphobia, once a source of shame, now felt like a survival instinct. But the outside world wouldn't stay outside. A few weeks later, my building's management sent out a notice, mandatory fire alarm testing. They would be entering every unit. There was no opting out. The thought of someone entering my space, my sanctuary, was terrifying enough. But the thought of a stranger, a potential static person, standing in my living room. I felt a panic so profound it left me breathless. I had to get out. For the first time in 18 months, I had to leave my apartment building. I chose a destination carefully, a small, independent grocery store 6 blocks away. Less crowded than a supermarket. I could do it. I put on a coat, pulled the hood deep over my face, and took the elevator down. The lobby was a nightmare. Marcus was at his post, a placid smile on his face. But 2 other people, a man in a suit and a woman with a stroller, were standing by the mailboxes. Frozen. The baby in the stroller was mid-cry, mouth open, but silent. A tableau of arrested motion. I scurried past them, heart pounding, not daring to look back. The street was worse. The rain had subsided to a fine mist, hanging in the air and blurring the edges of everything. It wasn't the crowds that unnerved me, but their movements. A cyclist's legs pumped with perfect, metronomic regularity, too smooth to be human. A group of tourists listening to a guide all turned their heads in uncanny unison, like animatronics. The world felt thin, a poor rendering struggling to maintain frame rate. I saw a man walking towards me, staring at his phone. He was about to walk directly into a lamppost. I opened my mouth to shout a warning, but before I could, he stopped. His foot hovered an inch from the metal pole. He took one step backward, a clean, digital-looking reset, and then sidestepped the obstacle, never looking up from his screen. He hadn't reacted to the near collision. He had simply followed a corrected path. I stumbled into the grocery store, gasping for air, the panic finally cresting. I leaned against a display of organic apples, trying to control my breathing. The store was quiet. An employee was stocking shelves, his movements fluid and normal. A woman was comparing 2 jars of pasta sauce. Everything seemed okay. Then I looked at the security monitor above the checkout counter. It showed the store from a high angle. And on the screen, I saw myself, leaning against the apples. But I also saw the woman with the pasta sauce. On the monitor, she wasn't moving. She was frozen in place, holding the 2 jars. But in front of me, in the real world, she had already made her choice and was walking away. There was a delay. A lag between reality and its recording. My gaze flicked from the real woman, now several feet away, to her static image on the screen. The screen was the truth. It showed the glitch. My own eyes, my own perception, had been fooled by the seamless correction. I wasn't just seeing the glitches. I was inside them, and my brain was papering over the cracks. I fled the store without buying anything. I ran back to my building, past the now moving figures in the lobby, and didn't stop until I had slammed and triple-locked the door to my apartment. I leaned against it, shaking. My sanctuary was a cage, but the world outside was a corrupted simulation. And I, with my broken, anxious brain, was the only one with the clearance to see the error codes. Underscore 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 underscore. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. My brief, disastrous trip outside cemented a terrifying new reality. The glitches weren't just happening out there. I was experiencing them, too, but my mind was automatically smoothing them over, hiding the missing frames. The security camera in the grocery store had shown me the raw data, the lag between the event and the perception of the event. My isolation wasn't just social, it was perceptual. I was living on a 5-second delay and my brain was lying to me about it. This revelation sent me back to the missing frame with a new, desperate focus. I had to understand the rules of this broken world. There was a user I'd been watching, pixel_peeler. Their posts were infrequent but incredibly insightful, technical, and detached. They had posited that the phenomenon wasn't a glitch in the pejorative sense, but a feature. A resource management protocol. The simulation can't render everything at high fidelity all at once, pixel_peeler had written in a post. It prioritizes. Active subjects, conscious observers, get more processing power. Background elements get downsampled. They're put in a low-power state. The stillness. The problem is, some of us are starting to notice the downsampling. Our perception is seeing beyond its permissions. I had to talk to them. Risking deletion, I sent a private, encrypted message. I think you're right. But it's worse. I think my own perception is being edited. To my shock, they replied within minutes. I know. It's called perceptual latency correction. A buffer. Most brains do it perfectly. Yours, and mine, are faulty. We're seeing the buffer. We talked for an hour, a frantic, exhilarating exchange of data and theories. Pixel_peeler, who I pictured as a basement-dwelling programmer like myself, somewhere in another city, equally trapped, believed the system was automated. It wasn't malicious, just ruthlessly efficient. When a user, a person, began to notice the errors, their own process became unstable, a drain on the system. That's why people get deleted from the forum, they wrote. Drawing attention, creating data, analyzing the system, it's like a rogue process eating up memory. The system's response is to terminate the process. Garbage collection. Garbage collection. That's what happened to Glitch Hunter 88. A digital janitor had swept him up. So what do we do? I typed, my fingers trembling. Stay low. Don't create data. Don't observe too closely. Try to blend in. The next day, I logged on to message pixel_peeler again. Their account was gone. User deleted. My chat log with them was corrupted, their username replaced with a meaningless string of characters, u_error_#8fg75. My blood ran cold. Our conversation had been the data. My desperate reach for connection had flagged them for termination. I had killed them. The contagion was no longer passive. It was reactive. It was listening. The glitches in my apartment escalated. It was no longer just the TV. The digital clock on my microwave would flicker, showing 12 o'clock, 3:45, error, 11:21 p.m., all in the space of a second, before settling on the correct time. A book I had left on my coffee table appeared back on the bookshelf, its bookmark tucked neatly inside, as if I had finished it and put it away myself. I hadn't touched it in days. Objects were being returned to their default states. The most terrifying development was my smart speaker. It had always been a benign presence, playing my rain sounds or adding almond milk to my shopping list. Now, it had started to whisper. In the dead of night, I'd hear it click on, and a synthesized voice, a distorted version of my own, would murmur fragments from my log. Stood motionless, for 17 minutes. A corrupted animation. It was reading my thoughts. It was accessing my most private data and feeding it back to me, a quiet, chilling warning. We know you know. My fortress was not only breached, it was now an active participant in my psychological torture. The theory from Pixel_Peeler and Cassandra_Complex felt horrifyingly correct. To notice was to be a bug. To analyze was to be a threat. The system wasn't trying to scare me, it was trying to self-correct, and I was the error it needed to fix. Then came the sync event. I had learned of them from Glitch Hunter 88's deleted posts. He claimed that at specific, seemingly random times, large sections of the population would freeze simultaneously. He called it a defrag cycle. I had never witnessed one, but I had started leaving a camera feed of the street corner open at all times, just in case. It happened on a Tuesday, at 8:04 p.m. I was eating a sad dinner of reheated soup at my desk. On the monitor, the street was bustling with evening traffic. And then, it stopped. Everything. The cars, the pedestrians, the swaying trees, the blinking traffic lights. The entire frame froze solid. A woman walking her dog was stopped mid-stride, the dog's ears perked. A man hailing a cab had his arm raised, frozen in the air. The world outside my window had become a photograph. My breath hitched. I looked at the clock on my computer. The seconds were still ticking. 8 hours 4 minutes and 1 second, 8 hours 4 minutes and 2 seconds. 8 hours 4 minutes and 3 seconds, for 3 complete seconds, the world held its breath. And then, at 8 hours 4 minutes and 4 seconds, it resumed. The cars moved, the woman completed her step, the man's hand dropped as a cab pulled over. There was no jolt, no confusion. The flow was seamless. The missing frames were perfectly patched. If you had blinked, you would have missed it. But I hadn't blinked. I had seen the system maintenance. I had witnessed the master process pause the simulation to reallocate resources. It was no longer a series of random, isolated bugs. It was an organized, scheduled event. The static people weren't just individuals suffering a glitch, they were nodes in a network being temporarily powered down. I felt a profound, cosmic dread settle over me. This wasn't something I could fight. You can't fight the operating system from within an application. You can't fight physics. My gaze drifted to the dark screen of my main monitor. In its reflection, I saw my own face, pale and terrified. And for a fraction of a second, my reflection glitched. My hand, holding my spoon, jittered, repeating the motion of lifting it to my mouth 3 times in rapid succession. A micro loop. My own personal lag. The system had found me. The buffer was failing. The garbage collector was coming for me. Underscore 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 underscore. Phase 4, Confrontation/Revelation and Aftermath. The confrontation, when it came, was not with a monster or an agent of the system. There was no knock on the door, no shadowy figure emerging from the walls. The confrontation was with myself, in the silent, blue-lit theater of my apartment. It was a choice. I saw the glitch in my reflection again, this time a flicker in my eyes, a momentary freeze as I turned my head. The perceptual latency was getting worse. The corrections were becoming visible. The system was flagging my process as unstable. I remembered Pixel_Peeler's last words, stay low. Blend in. Cassandra_Complex's final, cryptic post before she vanished had been a single line, the only way to win is not to play. I finally understood. To survive, I had to stop noticing. I had to unsee. I had to willingly downgrade my own perception, to accept the edited version of reality the system was feeding me. I had to let my brain lie to me. The choice was stark: cling to the horrifying truth and be user deleted, or embrace the seamless lie and become one of them. Become static. The horror of that choice was a physical thing. It was a cold knot in my stomach, a pressure behind my eyes. To give up the one thing that made me me, my awareness, my critical thought, felt like a death of its own. But the alternative was nothing. Deletion. Ceasing to exist. I sat at my desk, the city lights of Seattle glittering beyond my window, each one a node in the vast, faulty network. I took a deep, shuddering breath. And I began the process. It was a form of anti-meditation. I had to actively unlearn vigilance. I went to my log, my sacred text of the last few months, containing every piece of evidence I had gathered. My finger hovered over the delete key. It was my proof. It was my sanity. Deleting it felt like a betrayal of myself, of Glitch Hunter 88 and Pixel_Peeler and all the other ghosts of the missing frame. I closed my eyes and pressed the key. Are you sure you want to permanently delete the log? Yes. Next, I opened my browser and navigated to the missing frame. I looked at it one last time, the green text on the black screen, a tiny island of doomed truth-tellers. I closed the tab and then went into my history and cache and deleted every trace of it. The hardest part was managing my own senses. The next day, I forced myself to watch the lobby camera. I saw Marcus, the doorman, standing in his familiar, unnatural stillness. The old me, the me from yesterday, would have started a stopwatch. The new me forced my gaze away. I looked at the tile pattern on the floor. I thought about what to order for dinner. When I looked back, Marcus was moving, smiling at a resident. The gap, the freeze, had happened. I had simply chosen not to perceive it. I had let the buffer do its work. My weekly call with Maya became my final exam. I dreaded it, but I knew it was necessary. Her face appeared on screen, bright and lovely. We talked, the conversation flowing easily. And then it happened. Mid-sentence, her image froze. Her hand, holding a coffee mug, was raised halfway to her lips. The panic flared, a familiar jolt of adrenaline. My mind screamed, glitch. Freeze. It's happening. But I held my breath. I looked at her frozen face, the image of my sister turned into a digital artifact. I did not flinch. I did not speak. I simply waited. 3 seconds later, she unfroze, the mug now at her lips. And I just don't think blue is the right color for their branding, she said, continuing a thought from a conversation we hadn't been having. The seamless lie. The corrected path. No, you're right, I said, my voice perfectly calm, my heart a block of ice. Blue is too cold. Maybe a warm gray. I had passed the test. I had accepted the edit. Months have passed. I still live in my apartment. I still work my IT job. But something fundamental has shifted. My agoraphobia has faded, not because I am cured, but because the distinction between inside and outside has lost its meaning. The world is just a data stream, and I no longer care to analyze its code. My supervisor sent me an email last week. My performance metrics are at an all-time high. My calls are efficient, my solutions quick. I no longer get distracted. I keep the lobby camera feed on one of my monitors, not out of fear, but out of habit. Sometimes, I see Marcus standing still for long periods. I no longer time him. I see a neighbor across the way freeze while watering a plant. I don't log it. They are just background processes, running in low-power mode. It is normal. It is efficient. This morning, I had another call with Maya. She told me she was worried. You seem different, Eli, she said, a little frown on her face. Calmer, maybe. But distant. I'm fine, May, I told her, and the words felt true. Everything's fine. As I spoke, my own reflection in the dark monitor caught my eye. For a brief, silent moment, my mouth kept moving but no words came out. My image paused, buffered, and then snapped back into sync with my real self. A minor glitch. A small correction. I saw it. And I felt nothing at all.